Keegster30 and welcome to the Amnesia series review. The Amnesia series is most well known for its first game, Amnesia the Dark Descent, and its sequels have been, well, somewhat received, and would probably be obscure games if not for the Amnesia label. The notable exception to this being the recently released Amnesia the Bunker. I'm going to be talking about all of the Amnesia games, including Justine in this video, so buckle up, keep your arms and legs inside the vehicle, and please, try not to scream too loudly. Amnesia the Dark Descent was released in 2010, and it aged, well, it certainly aged. When I played through the game, I thought, wow, this looks surprisingly good for an indie game studio in 2010, but surprisingly good for an indie game studio in 2010 isn't the same as, this game looks good. I'm going to be talking about the horror of this game a bit later, but that's been talked about plenty already by others, so for now I'm going to discuss the other parts of the game. I know that judging the graphics of a 2010 indie game from today's perspective seems ridiculous because, like, what, should I be expecting ray tracing from The Dark Descent? But it shouldn't need ray tracing or fancy modern techniques to look good. Just the fact that this game didn't age well shows the distinction between style and graphics and which one The Dark Descent prioritized. If a game has good graphics, then it makes the attempt to look as realistic as possible by pushing the current technology and monetary limitations. If a game has a good style, then it makes the attempt to look as good as possible within the limitations. Trying to develop for style makes it impossible for the game to age poorly because the limitations aren't the ceiling. Creativity is the ceiling. This is the reason why many Nintendo games still hold up well today despite being old. Super Mario Bros. Isn't going to look any worse or better in 40 years because it wasn't trying to hit peak realism with 8-bit graphics, it just tried to look good. I think that many game systems from Nintendo after the NES struggled a bit with this, because for a while Nintendo was still trying to compete with PlayStation and Sega in making the best looking games rather than the best playing games. Super Mario Kart feels incredibly off when played today, and Super Mario 64, while still playing great, often feels quite outdated. In contrast, The Wind Waker attempted to stay away from realism and therefore still looks like it could have been released by an indie or AA studio today, despite being released 2 decades ago. Amnesia the Dark Descent attempted to go for the best graphics possible rather than the best style possible. It doesn't look awful, but it certainly looks surprisingly good for an indie game studio from 2010. Playing through the game, it was hard not to notice the graphics and think, yep, this was released in 2010. Things like dust particles being very clearly just a bunch of sprites, or this magic beam which looks straight out of some random fantasy game. Graphics obviously aren't everything, but when it becomes a distraction and takes you out of the immersion, it's definitely something. But what about the gameplay? The Dark Descent is a horror game, but horror really tells you nothing about what a game is like. If you strip away the horror, then what do you find underneath? Do you find a game that is fun to play, or a game you just want to get through quickly to see the next spooks? Resident Evil games are horror games on top, but actually good shooter games underneath, which is why even the least horror-focused Resident Evil games manage to stay successful. In contrast, Layers of Fear is a literal walking simulator if you take away the horror. That doesn't make Layers of Fear a worse game, but it's important to know what to expect if the horror fails on you. Any horror game will have times when it fails at horror, and Amnesia the Dark Descent is no exception. So, on the gameplay front, the Dark Descent is a mediocre puzzle/exploration game. You find a thing, and then you also find another thing, and you use the item on the thing. That's what most of the puzzles are in The Dark Descent. Not exciting, but most often not stupid puzzles at least. Some of them get more creative, however. There's one where you have to pull some levers around, another where you have to arrange some pipes, and even one where you have to move these hanging weights up and down. Although all those puzzles are in the same area, the rest of the game is mostly just find an item and interact with another type of puzzles. And those creative puzzles don't even have incredibly interesting solutions either. Both the pipe puzzle and the hanging weights puzzle are solved by just copying what's on the other side, and the lever puzzle is solved by remembering what some guy said in a note earlier. A good puzzle should make the player think, maybe even get stuck, but ultimately come to the solution either by accident or on purpose, and think, that was a clever solution. None of the puzzles in this game do that. When I found the solution to the puzzles I got stuck on, my reaction was just, oh yeah, I guess I should have realized that earlier. It's not satisfying to solve any puzzle, it's just the next step to find the next area. The exploration part of the game is pretty neat though. Although what I said about the graphics is still true in my opinion, each area feels creepy and cool in a unique way. There's your standard castle type places, the dungeons, the machines, the distilleries, the magical fortresses, and even the outside. Each new place is only unlocked after you find some method to unlock it, meaning that everywhere you are, you'll at least spend some bit of time around it. This makes it so that no location in the game feels wasted. There's no location you can skip, and you might even have to come back there. If the game didn't have such varied and interesting locations, then staying too long in one location would not be such a good thing. But it does, so it is. It also has a repeated system of progression through the castle. There are 4 hub areas: the front hall, the back hall, the cistern, and the nave. The front hall and the back hall are fairly standard castle places. Then the cistern switches things up a bit by being all strange looking and with drawbridges and such, and then the nave just throws the player into a full medieval fantasy setting. This serves to thematically follow the story as Daniel progresses from viewing the castle as just a castle to finding out about the inner workings of the castle and the true horrors that went on underneath. Daniel is the main character of The Dark Descent, one of 3 characters who we actually see in the game. He wakes up in the castle with no memory of anything but his name and that he willfully forgot everything. This explains the title, Amnesia. Through memories and diaries found throughout the castle, the player is able to learn about what happened to Daniel before the events of The Dark Descent. I say the player learns and not Daniel learns because it hardly feels like the player is Daniel. He never says a word in the present, making Daniel feel like less of a character and more of a blank slate for the player to play as. In a way, that is what he became, having amnesia and all, but it would feel more impactful to see him realizing what his past was instead of the game showing us, here's what the player character Daniel's past was. There are 2 Daniels in The Dark Descent, the character from the summer of 1839 right before the game starts, and the Daniel in the present, who doesn't exist. I also hate to be nitpicky, but come on with the storytelling. Diaries and memories. Could someone please explain to me, in the context of the story, how Daniel managed to write a diary and then just scattered the pages all over the castle, including in the inner workings of the basement, also somehow so that the current Daniel can find the pages in chronological order? And then the memories. Daniel remembers bits and pieces of the past by traveling through the castle, which makes me question, what on earth was in that memory removing serum Daniel took? Was the serum specifically designed to make him forget everything, but then have his memories come back later and somehow in an order that reveals the story but not too much of it? Or was the serum designed to give him complete and permanent amnesia, yet he remembers things anyways and still in that perfect order? Incredibly nitpicky, I know, but it's just another thing that makes it hard to get immersed. It's also probably the worst way to tell a story in this game specifically, as I will explain a little more when I talk about the horror. So, anyways, Daniel has found himself in a castle with no memories. He decides to explore the castle and learns more information about himself and why he wants to kill a man named Alexander. Daniel was an archaeologist, and one day he found himself and his team stuck in a cave in Algiers. It seems like there should be no way out, but then Daniel found an orb and tried taking it, which somehow saved them. The orb broke into pieces, but Daniel held on to it anyways. And, sorry, but another nitpick incoming. In this segment of the story, in the castle, there also appears to be rocks and boulders blocking areas, as if there was a real cave-in. It is another case of the setting fitting the story, but it just doesn't make sense. At this point, Daniel isn't in the basement, so where are all these rocks coming from? Is the castle inside of a mountain or something? But that doesn't really seem right since you can see outside. If the game were inside of Daniel's head, then it would make sense for reality to mold around the story, but the game isn't. There's magic in the story, but magic that applies to other characters and not just what Daniel happens to be learning about in his past. Just a nitpick again, yet I'm noticing how often I feel like I have to state these nitpicks. After Daniel makes it back to Europe with the orb pieces, it initially seems like he made it out intact. But then, Will Smith dies, and the other people involved in the expedition start dying soon afterwards. It turns out, Daniel made a mistake by taking the orb. Now, a being called a Shadow is after Daniel to get the orb back. This is the result of the universe wanting to correct what was supposed to leave the orb in its original place. So basically, Daniel ended up in a Final Destination movie. Because, the orb that was right there for Daniel to take and had been taken by many powerful figures throughout history, it clearly has a powerful force stopping it from being moved anywhere. The story doesn't make much sense, but whatever. Daniel ends up seeking help from a man named Alexander, who happens to live in the castle the game is set in. Alexander claims to know how to save Daniel from the Shadow, but it isn't going to be easy. He needs Daniel to perform a ritual to stop the Shadow's chase. As it turns out, the Shadow, some godlike force of the universe, is easily distracted by other people's death instead of the one it truly wants. So, Daniel starts out by torturing and killing a convicted murderer. After all, what's the cost of one murderer's life if it can save his own? Unfortunately for Daniel and the downstairs residents of Brennenburg, that's not it. The shadow is not satisfied. It wants Daniel, and one body is not going to keep the shadow satiated for long. Of course, Daniel is a selfish man, and there happens to be a convenient prison within the castle, so he finds more people to torture and murder. There are some very graphic depictions and descriptions of the torture in this game, which I will not be repeating here, but it's enough to know that Daniel did some pretty awful things to the unlucky prisoners here. But the prisoners are still a limited supply. So Daniel goes around and finds men, women, and even children to prolong his own life. However, when chasing down a little girl, Daniel comes to a realization. Killing a murderer to save his own life, while still an ethical issue, is defensible. Killing and torturing many innocent people to prolong his own life by a short amount of time, however, just makes Daniel a coward and a serial killer. But Daniel knows what is wrong. It's Alexander who led him to the idea for this ritual. It's Alexander who had been torturing animals and people long before Daniel got here. It's Alexander who continued to push Daniel along the path of self-destruction so that Alexander could gain power on his own. Daniel sees this and takes it upon himself to clear his memories, start anew, and hunt down the evil Alexander. The game ends in one of three ways. In this magic beam room, Daniel finds Alexander. Alexander has summoned this magic portal out of the power he got from Daniel's killing spree and the Vitae and some sort of complicated explanation. The magic portal would give Alexander some great power or something. After going through it, the game's mythology was really poorly explained. And it explains more about how these things come to be rather than why or what they do. The ending I got was by not knowing there was a time limit in the room and ending up doing nothing at all. Alexander went through the portal and Daniel died to the shadow, remembering the screams of his victims. Ending 2 is a bit better. Daniel throws this guy Agrippa's head into the portal, and then Daniel appears to die from the shadow, but Agrippa saves him. And finally, ending 3 seems to be the best, at least for Daniel. He knocks down these towers and kills Alexander, also the shadow dies, I guess, and Daniel walks out without any guilt left. But like, what? What? What the heck was that? What's the point of the story? The shadow is like a Final Destination presence, but it only succeeds in one ending. And what are the other enemies after the player for? I don't even know what was going on with Agrippa because I couldn't even understand most of his dialogue. I guess he was a former friend of Alexander who Alexander kept hostage in the dungeons? And Alexander. He certainly was a villain, alright. He did evil stuff directly against the main character, and probably had evil wishes. I don't know though. Sure makes for a very engaging villain. Then my main problem is still Daniel. This is the guy we should be rooting for? The torturer and murderer of the innocent? Oh, but of course he was influenced by Alexander. Influenced how? By Alexander suggesting murder to him? I'm pretty sure that Daniel is supposed to be a largely bad character based on this, but the fact that there's an ending with him going home guilt-free makes that seem like a very strange choice. He doesn't have memories of what he's done, and I wouldn't argue for going all White Bear on him, but unharmed and guilt-free seems like a very unclear message. Also, his character development. It seems like it was meant to be a tragedy with his character downfall and all, but his selfishness really only shows up when he starts murdering people. Unless the game is trying to say that taking the orb was selfish, but how is Daniel supposed to know that? And I think that is what the game was trying to say about Daniel. He was selfish for taking an orb from a dig site that saved his life. Guess I should be really careful about what stuff I pick up. I do still really like how the game mixes the setting with the story, although it broke my immersion at times. Even the title, The Dark Descent, reflects Daniel's character arc. I think this story is ridiculous, poorly thought out, and very predictable, but at least it had a story. Otherwise, there wouldn't be much of a reason to explore the castle. So for that I say thank you to The Dark Descent for doing the bare minimum by including what could be considered a story. Now, I probably shouldn't have delayed this part for this long, but it's time to analyze the horror of The Dark Descent. What makes it so that many people have claimed it to be one of the scariest horror games of all time? My definition of horror in a video game is a game that gives the player a feeling of danger and dread, whether or not there actually is something ready to kill them. A great horror game should make the player feel both panic and uncertainty. In any case, uncertainty should be a major factor in how the game works, because otherwise the game isn't scary anymore. Knowing exactly how to defeat an enemy and where the enemy is at all times means that the enemy is no longer a threat to the player. Or even if it is, it just forces the player to give in rather than worry about the threat. That being said, non-horror games have both panic and uncertainty, so what makes my definition exclusive to horror games? I think that the combination of both panic and uncertainty at the same time makes horror so frightening. In a shooter game, you will experience both panic and uncertainty at different times, but rarely at the same time. When starting out with a shooter game, you won't really know what to do, but there's also no reason for you to panic because the stakes tend to be incredibly low, and you probably can just figure out that other players will start shooting you. In a good horror game, you don't know what the enemy is going to do if there is one at all, and that brings both uncertainty and a reason to panic when you see any sign of danger. When you've played a shooter game for a while, you may panic because you found yourself in a bad situation, but you still know what options you have and your rough chances of getting out alive. It can still definitely be scary, but you're a mostly competent player at this point and you know what to expect. In a horror game, enemy encounters should certainly make you panic and leave you guessing at what's going to happen next. In Amnesia: The Dark Descent, the first half is incredibly scary because of that fact. You don't know what to expect unless you got it spoiled by watching a 2-hour review. In the first entire hour, you will encounter no enemies, but the atmosphere makes it feel like you will. You're given wardrobes to hide in and candles to light, yet no explanation of why you can do this. It hints at there being something to hide from, but it doesn't show anything conclusive. To add on to this, the game is visually incredibly dark. You won't be able to see anything without a light for more than 10 feet away from the player, so all that's left is for you to guess what lies beyond the darkness. Very early on, I walked into this dark room, but I could barely see a shadowy human figure inside. I very carefully went further, ready to run out as soon as possible if I even could, but all it was a suit of armor. The lack of monsters at the start of the game leaves all the scariness to the player's imagination, and who knows what horrors lie in the imagination of the average gamer. There could be literally anything within the darkness, and to top it off, the longer the player stays in the darkness, the more distorted the player's vision gets. This can make it very easy to imagine things moving when they really aren't, or jump in fright when seeing a wooden board in a place you don't remember the wooden board being. There's literally nothing for the player to worry about in the first hour, yet the player doesn't know that. All the sounds and doors opening would lead you to believe that there is something roaming the halls to hunt the player. Of course, that can only go on so long before the player catches wind of the fact that they haven't encountered anything. And the horror doesn't end when encountering the first monster. Upon entering the cellar archives, I met what is probably the most famous monster in the game, and you can't even see it. It's this water creature thing, and it will attack anyone and anything unlucky enough to end up in the water. If you want to avoid it, then you'll have to jump on crates and other objects, just like playing the floor is lava. I think what makes this monster so memorable is the sheer level of panic it instills when falling into the water. When jumping from box to box, you expect to make the jump, since that's just how games work. But the movement in this game isn't exactly designed for this. Normally that would be a bad thing, but here it works so that most players will end up falling into the water accidentally. When this happens, the mind has a short amount of time to react. Suddenly, you've felt the fear of missing your platform. Then, you feel the fear of being in the water with a monster around. Now you need to scramble to get out of the water with no idea of if you can make it or not. This all happens within a second, defying the player's initial expectations of safety and presenting an immediate danger. This is where the true horror lies, showing the player that no matter what they do, they're never safe. You may feel safe, but that feeling can be taken away at a moment's notice. To me personally, that wasn't the scariest part of the game, or even one of the scariest encounters in video games. It gave me intense panic during those moments, sure, but it was clear what I had to do. I just had to stay on the boxes. How unpredictable jumping from box to box could be was where the intense panic came from, but I could always take a breather if I needed to, or maybe just throw some human flesh in the water so that it'll leave me alone for a little bit. A very scary and very great introduction to what the game's horror is, but scariest monster ever is an over-exaggeration, unless you haven't played many horror games since then. The Dark Descent has a large issue with being made in 2010 and played by me for the first time in 2023, because many games which came after it take elements from The Dark Descent. I can see this actually being the scariest monster ever if I had played it in 2010, but the notoriety of this game is honestly what caused it to age so poorly. If The Dark Descent hadn't let everyone know this is how you do horror excellently, then this might very well have been the scariest thing I've experienced, but it did, so here we are today. The next monster you encounter is, for the next hour, the scariest thing in the game. It's this weird skin thing, and it's the only other monster in the game. There are technically two variants of it, but the other one just looks slightly different, runs faster, and will kill you in one hit. The first time I encountered the skin monster was in the storage, probably also the scariest location in the entire game. There had been dark hallways before, but not like this. You can't see a thing through here, and while you're going down one, there might be something coming from another. When I first entered this area, I took the coward's way out and just turned back immediately. I hoped that I could maybe find something else where to turn the lights on before coming back, but there were no more lights. The only lights I could turn on are by hand while using a limited number of tinder boxes, and they require me venturing out into the dark and scary hallway to access them. I had such a large feeling of dread here, and it makes sense that this is where the game chose to introduce its skin monster. I decided to just enter this room to the left first, since it looked the least spooky. I looked around it, but then I heard a noise from outside. Just another meaningless scare, I thought, since I had gotten used to the game's tricks, before I looked outside. And there it was. I had no idea of what to do, so rather than what would probably be the best course of action and just run for the exit, I backed up to hide behind a wall and hoped it wouldn't come in my room. I decided to peek after a little, but it turned out I had made the wrong decision. It was coming in. The only thing that saved my life was that a glitch caused it to not attack me properly, but I took that and just ran out of there as fast as I could. But I had to come back. I left two other hallways unexplored, and I couldn't leave without going there. I came back, and I didn't see the monster at first. I assumed it must have gone to one of the two other hallways. After exploring around, living in fear that the monster would find me, I then had explored every bit of those two hallways and realized something. The monster was gone. The developers tricked me. By having the monster show up so suddenly and leave just as suddenly, it makes the storage area as scary as possible. After seeing the monster, I was so convinced that I'd see it somewhere else, because where could it have gone? If I had actually seen the monster after coming back, then it would be a far less scary experience, because I'd know the monster's location and I'd take note of where to avoid. Instead, I lived in dread, waiting for what may or may not come. It's a nasty trick that was pulled on me, but it worked. Take the knowledge away from the player, but give them a reason to fear something. The next scariest part came soon after, in the cells, and it does similar things to the storage area. Dark hallways, multiple paths, suddenly appearing and disappearing monster. Same thing, new place, but just as scary because the monster seems to appear more often, which doesn't give me the option of assuming it's safe because the monster disappeared again. If that were the entirety of Amnesia: The Dark Descent, then I'd say the game earned its place as one of the scariest horror games of all time. But that isn't the game. That's the first half of the game, and I left a little bit out of it. Remember how I mentioned that the story is being told through letters and memories? That is part of what ruins the horror. If you're reading a letter, then the rest of the game pauses and it means that you are in complete safety. Safe areas are nice to have sprinkled around so that the game isn't just a total adrenaline rush, but it's not good to make it so obvious to the player in rooms that may have been considered scary otherwise. I go into this room thinking there might be a monster inside, but oh look, there's a letter. Guess this room is safe. It removes most of the well-earned tension from the situation just to explain a little bit more of the story. And then the memories. Those will just pop up at seemingly random times, not even from finding them on desks. You can just be walking down a spooky hallway, then suddenly your vision changes and you're remembering something. The game won't send any monster after you during a memory because it wants you to pay attention to the story. So now there's nothing spooky about the hallway. You may come back there after getting the next important story item and find something scary, but you know that for a little bit anyways, you're perfectly safe. This wouldn't be as much of an issue if the game didn't give you the time to learn just how safe you are. If the game were just the first half, it would be a short and very scary experience, something like PT. Unfortunately, the next couple of hours just ruined the horror that had been built up so well. First off, the second half sees many well-lit areas. No horrors up to the imagination now, the only horror you'll be seeing will be obvious. Great, there goes the tension of exploration. It was very noticeable of a shift when I heard a noise in the second half, and instead of thinking, oh no, what was that, I should get out of here, I just looked over, saw a monster, and thought, aw man, guess I could die now. And that's further amplified by the other thing the second half does wrong, which is reusing the same skin monster enemy. Now I know exactly how to deal with it. If it sees me, run and hope for a safe area. If it doesn't, then just hide and wait for it to walk away. The faster variant only changes one element. If it sees me, then I guess I'm just dead if there's not a hiding spot or an exit right near me. Now, I'm going to compare two clips that show me reacting to a scare in the first half and in the second half. Yeah, 17. Yeah, drill part. No to that. No! Holy. I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die. No! Oh. There's a lot. Yeah. No. 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 Why? How? I can't go faster. There's no way I can go faster. Oh, that. There's no way I can go faster. You good? I'm still running from the monster in the second half, but I'm more just trying to run away because I'd rather not die instead of running away from the fear of death. Throughout the second half, I knew how the game systems worked, and that stopped it from being scary anymore. Spooky things and occasional scares were around, sure, but other than that, the horror was just gone. And what was underneath the horror? A mediocre puzzle/exploration game with an uninteresting story. The second half lasted 3 hours for me, so I'm going to give Amnesia: The Dark Descent a 7 out of 10 overall. If the tension of the first half had carried over to the second half, then it could have been an 8 or a 9 for me. Although the first half carried over would still suffer from an uninteresting and pointless story. If the lack of tension from the second half had been in the first half, then it would have been a 3 or a 4. The Dark Descent isn't a Resident Evil game, there's no gameplay to carry it when the horror fails. Instead, it was 3 hours of occasionally tense moments followed by 3 hours of boredom. There was originally going to be a greenhouse area of the game with 2 more flower-themed monsters, but it was ultimately scrapped. I think that The Dark Descent with the greenhouse could have been a really good game, keeping up with the great tension and mystery the first half presented. Instead, it takes what worked well once and stretches it out 3 more hours than it needed to be. At 6 hours of playtime, The Dark Descent is still a short game, but it is somehow longer than it should have been. I can see why people love this game. I can easily see it being a lot better if the year were 2010. This review is a 2023 review, however, and I'm not giving the game mercy for being the victim of coming out 13 years ago. It could have held up well today, but the game's philosophy overall was one of graphics over style, pushing the boundaries of today and creating something that only lasts the day. Using one gimmick that worked well and stretching it to fit the whole game, it is really clear that the design philosophy was used for more than just graphics. The Dark Descent found its limits, and rather than being creative within the limits, just told everyone, look how scary I can be. Plenty of games that pushed the boundaries didn't compromise like that and still hold up well today. Doom 1993, which I played for the first time last year, was a great experience. This game, however, is a 2010 masterpiece and nothing more. Justine is an expansion to The Dark Descent, and is notable for being the only DLC in the Amnesia series. It's under an hour long and can be even faster depending on how you play. When I played it for the first time, this is what I got from the story. You are Justine, and you can listen to recordings of your past self as you explore your dungeons. Your past self explains that this is an experiment to see if you will choose life or death on the 3 others captured there. However, there are also some other monsters around, and more notes to learn about Justine's backstory. Apparently there were also 3 people who loved Justine's but had their lives ruined by her, and Justine also had an awful childhood where people did experiments on her. After finishing the dungeons, whether you save people or not, you go up to safety and dinner and leave the dungeon locked. I looked a little more into the story, since I felt there was strangely little to it, but the only thing I found that added to the story was the realization that the monsters in the dungeon are Justine's former boyfriends. Justine's just an awful person that's been keeping everyone trapped down there and giving herself amnesia to play a sort of game. The story was fine, I guess. I didn't really expect more from such a short game, but it also just made me leave thinking, did I get that alright? The story is really just that simple without even a possibility of different endings? The stories in these games just feel like they're only there so that there can be a story, not what the story has to express. There's no real takeaway from the story, nothing interesting about it, it's just there. Also, the fact that the ending doesn't change if you save people or kill them is a bit strange. What's the point of offering such a choice if it doesn't affect the ending? I think both The Dark Descent and Justine try to give a purposefully bad character in an attempt to pose some moral question, but they also don't seem to care enough to really ask it. Justine's just an awful person. Daniel's also awful, but he doesn't remember it, so maybe there's something about him worth saving? But the game also just doesn't seem to care about that question. It can give Daniel his happy ending if you want, saying he is absolved from sin, and Justine saving people doesn't matter because she's saving them from nothing. Her killing them equally doesn't matter because they die in the end anyways from being locked in the dungeons. I really dislike when games just throw out a story to have a story, since it makes you think, but unlike masterpieces that make you think, these stories just make you think about what on earth was the point of the story. But I actually do think Justine succeeded in the horror department. Justine, well, it just has some more of that great Amnesia horror done right all the way through this time. It starts off in the cell block, where all seems good until you turn around out of cell and find the first suitor, leaving you yet again in panic and with limited options. I was reminded a lot of my first time in storage, since just like then I ran right back into the cell instead of making any attempt to run further away. It was literally just repeating something from the Dark Descent, sure, but it does it in an effective way. I wasn't expecting that to happen again, and the unexpectedness is what made the horror work. On the other side, the second half of the Dark Descent didn't work because nothing was surprising anymore. Although, the next area in Justine did just feel like more Amnesia the Dark Descents, and so it was just a standard monster walking around and you having to hide so that it doesn't attack you. Apparently the monsters in this game are blind, which I didn't know, so I thought it was scarier than it actually was. But scarier than it actually was equals scarier than intended, because scariness ultimately is all in the player's head. If the fact that I didn't know they were blind led me to think that they were more dangerous than reality, then it actually becomes scarier than if I knew that. It's just like what I said about the first hour of The Dark Descent. Horror created from lack of knowledge, yet a reason to panic. I can't unknow the knowledge of The Dark Descent and replay that game for an equally scary experience, but this game presents a new Dark Descent-like experience, and that newness is enough to revive the horror. The last suitor of the game is in a water area, but this one doesn't have a water monster like in the first game. They really just put that water monster in one 10-minute section of that game, and it's been living in everyone's head since then. But here, the third suitor is honestly terrifying, and far better than if there were just another water monster. Out of the Dark Descent and Justine, this is probably my scariest encounter. The monster's still blind, but you're walking through water and you make a lot of noise. I had no idea about this when I played, so it ended up with me dying for what appeared to be no reason at all. I was terrified when this thing came charging at me because it was so outside of what I had come to expect. Walking around before had been perfectly safe, but now I make enough noise to draw attention. It's just like that sheer panic from the first water monster. You expect safety and then immediately are presented with danger. Except this time, you also don't know exactly what the monster is capable of. Intense panic sprinkled with a dash of uncertainty. Now, my second time trying the water monster. Hey, wait a second, what happened to the game? Dying at Justine intentionally crashes the game, making you start at the beginning, because death is permanent. This really does make the game a whole lot scarier because of the high stakes, but also far more annoying to try and learn. I died twice at the water section and got out only by sheer luck. I didn't know that the monster could hear you in the water until researching after. It turns out that you can pull the lever down to temporarily stop the monster, and that was enough to get me out of there. The permadeath did make the encounter even more terrifying the second time, now that I understood the stakes, but also all the more frustrating the second time I died. This permadeath would be a horrible mechanic in a long game like The Dark Descent, but it works okay here. Justine is really the only Amnesia game where this mechanic could work, at about an hour of gameplay. I give Justine a 7.5 out of 10. I obviously didn't get a whole lot out of it, being a short experience with another annoying story, but it was truly terrifying at times. Frustrating, too. It's really strange that this DLC exists at all, but I'm somewhat glad it does, as it reminded me of what the Dark Descent had at the start. More unknowns, different mechanics, and the illusion of choice are able to revive the horror in a game that I thought had already lost its potential. I find A Machine for Pigs' existence even stranger than Justine because it is the only Amnesia game not developed by Frictional Games. The Chinese room initially started development with approval from Frictional Games as a mod for The Dark Descent, but A Machine for Pigs soon became its own game and launched in September of 2013. And I don't just find the fact that it exists strange. There are many questionable design choices made with Amnesia A Machine for Pigs, which explain the quite mixed reviews it received compared to the acclaim of its predecessor. I suppose you could technically call the original Amnesia game a survival horror, given the inventory mechanics, health, and limited resources, but I wouldn't really go that far. The resources are either key items, tinderboxes, or laudanum. The key items have nothing to do with survival. The tinderboxes help your sanity, which only affects how scary things look. And the laudanum heals you, which is the most survival horror thing in the Dark Descent. A machine for pigs, meanwhile, no inventory at all. Earlier I mentioned that if a horror game fails at the horror, then there's one thing left to save it from being a bad game: the gameplay. So what does a machine for pigs do with the gameplay? For the complaining I did about the Dark Descent's mostly uninteresting puzzles, at least it had them. A Machine for Pigs is a walking simulator under the horror. I can see how this may make it more immersive, because stopping the story in horror to have a puzzle break or opening up an inventory may be a distraction from the horror. I specifically remember one time in the Dark Descent when I was running from a monster, got hurt, and then thought, I bet I have some laudanum, and then opened my inventory while the monster behind me kindly waited until I was healed. In this game, there's no breaking from the action, well, other than the 80% of the time when you're just walking around with no threat in sight. I could also see another reason why these developers may have gone in this direction. One of the things the Dark Descent was notable for was taking the weapons away from the player and making the player absolutely powerless, a complete opposite from the way other games were heading at the time. Resident Evil 5 and soon Resident Evil 6, and then also the cancelled Doom 4, which was intended to be more like Call of Duty. In that sense, it would sound like a much better decision for this game to take even more away from the player, appealing even more to a market forgotten by developers who seek the big shooter market. It's not an awful sounding idea, and it's worked decently well for Bloober Team, a company known for making horror walking simulators, although they have recently stated that they will no longer be making them and moving to more traditional horror types. But the idea of a walking simulator feels like it was taken by someone who has heard of Amnesia: The Dark Descent and not played it. The tinderboxes alone added another layer to the gameplay, giving you the illusion of control over the horror, while in reality being another tool to give the player a false sense of security. Or even a real sense of terror, knowing that if you could just light up the place with some tinderboxes it would be safer, but you can't and you're stuck and you don't know what to do and you just want to get somewhere safe. Taking that away takes away a crucial part from the first game, making the game feel out of place in the Amnesia series, almost like it was developed by different developers. Then there's the fact that, well, you can only do so much in a walking simulator. A Machine for Pigs is the shortest full game in the Amnesia series, as it took me just under 4 hours to complete. At some point, the developers must have decided that the player might be getting tired at the 4-hour mark of turning valves and pushing levers, since that is all the gameplay amounts to. And of course, there's still a couple of the classic move this object to this other clearly marked object puzzles that we've all come to love and enjoy. There could have easily been actual puzzles in this game, or maybe something else that isn't turning valve number 33. Just because you don't have an inventory doesn't mean that there needs to be nothing to the gameplay. Also, far fewer objects allow you to interact with them. This was a real shame for me, who loves picking up random objects and throwing them around, because that's just a fun kind of thing. Oh, yeah, and the general immersion of being able to interact with the world. That's important too. But removing the gameplay does take one aspect from the Dark Descent. All else is worthless when compared to the story. If I had to take a guess, that would be the main reason to explain the lack of any sort of gameplay. I'm going to talk about the technical aspects a little before I talk about the story, which is clearly meant to be the main focus of the game now. I mentioned that the graphics of 2010's The Dark Descent were noticeably dated, and while A Machine for Pigs 3 years later doesn't improve it that much, I've somehow found it much more immersive in that regard. I'm not sure if it has to do with the greater focus of style, which it honestly might be, but it could also be because those 3 years were enough to change my reaction to the game. I think it could be the style because of how everything else in the game changed to meet the story, but it could also be that they just got rid of the very noticeable low points, which in itself does make it a style thing, keeping the graphics of consistent quality instead of the mixed bag of the Dark Descent. Although the lightning effects still suck here, but saying that is a very small nitpick compared to the just number of times it took me out of the gameplay in the Dark Descent. Here it only took me out of the gameplay when I saw the lightning effect, which may have been 3 times in the whole game. The other notable aspect on the technical side, though, was the bugs and glitches of this game. There were certainly a few I noticed in the Dark Descent, but nothing that impacted my experience much. In A Machine for Pigs, I encountered noticeably more, including once where I just fell out of the world and died, and for each one, that's an immersion break. There was also another one which was supposed to be intended as a little spook, but the trigger for it was delayed, giving me the chance to just see the kid waiting for me to appear. Nothing as buggy as your modern AAA game, but for a game willing to sacrifice everything else for your immersion, it certainly does let a lot of bugs slip by. So, the story of the game. Daniel's story I followed with initially a bit of interest, which then turned into disappointment. A Machine for Pigs shows me the story of Oswald Mandus, who I was originally uninterested in, but then came to be a whole slightly interested in by the end. I'm going to give my interpretation of the story, but then after writing this, I'm going to tell what the details I missed were, or what the fans think, since I doubt everything is made clear. At the start of the story, Mandus wakes up in the top floor of a mansion. He then sees his children running away from him, and he starts to chase after them to try and find them. Except, unlike the last two protagonists, Mandus remembers everything about himself. He's the father of two children, Edwin and Enoch, and the owner of this meat processing plant. This might also just be me, but his name is the most forgettable name, and I had to write it down so that I could mention him in this review. Just like in the past, A Machine for Pigs tells its story through my favorite methods, diaries and memories. The diaries don't make any more canonical sense to be spread around the area, and same with the memories. Although, there are two new methods of storytelling. One of them is that Mandus finds voice recordings and telephone calls from a mysterious other person, and the other method is that Mandus writes journal entries as the game goes on. I thought both were far more natural methods of storytelling, and it addresses one of my main complaints about the story of The Dark Descent. The main character actually is a character in the present. He reacts to things, he isn't just a blank face. Although I wouldn't exactly call his present self the most engaging character, or even more of a character than the most blank slate father wants to find his children's character. So, on to his children. The first place Mandus looks is the attic, since that is where his children were raised. In the attic. I'm already starting to get a bad feeling about Mandus. No wonder why his children are running from him. Mandus then traverses through the attic and the rest of the house, mainly through secret passages. Through the diary entries, we find out that he used these passages to spy on his wife while she took baths, and in general, spies on people. So I'm not really seeing Mandus as all that great of a person. But still, he goes on with the I have to find my children, even though in all honesty, they really should be hiding from him. Through another note, it is revealed that his wife, Lilibeth, died in 1890. This game is set in December 1899, or maybe New Year's 1900, about 60 years after Daniel's story. This game is also not a sequel to the story, but it takes some elements, like addressing the Castle Brennenburg, which was the setting of the last game. I didn't realize this immediately, but fairly soon after I heard about Lilibeth's death in 1890, I realized something. If she died 9 or 10 years ago, how are the children still so young? And I realized something else. They're probably just dead. I bet this was intended to be some big twist that they were afraid people might get mad at if done incorrectly, so they gave as many clues as possible beforehand. The children disappear around the corner at random as if they didn't exist at all, and Mandus has been shown to imagine things such as the memories he has. I would assume from this that in the final release the player was made to figure this out, like, just before the reveal, and that's why there were so many clues, but it just adds to the disconnect between the player and the player character. The blank slate, I need to find my children father, is very frustrating to play as when you know he's an awful father and you assume his children are dead already. Anyways, down through the house he goes. Apparently this guy on the phone might know something about Mandus' situation too. Mandus heads outside into the streets, which is an interesting setting for an Amnesia game. Also, there's nobody in the streets. This either means that there happens to be nobody in the streets, which is possible at nighttime, or something else. It feels weird that there would be no noise or sign of people in London, even in 1899, and yes, I have been to London in the year 1899 to verify that, which led me to thinking something else. What if this is all in Mandus' head? Anyway, enough of these theories, back to the story. Mandus goes to his meat processing plant to begin his dark descent. His children are apparently deep down in the factory, and he needs to go down there to follow them. Just like the darkness we learn about Mandus' character, it also works into the fact that he is literally doing a dark descent, hey, I feel like we've done this before in a different game. Though in A Machine for Pigs, he also goes up sometimes, which I'm now realizing probably had to do with his character development toward the end. But for now, Mandus is heading down. It turns out, deep within the factory, experiments were being carried out on pigs. Mandus wanted to turn them into man-pig things? Okay. He who makes a beast out of himself gets rid of the pain of being a man. Not what I previously thought of as an original song lyric for Bat Country, but instead an actual quote from Samuel Johnson. This quote popped up at the start of the game, and I guess Mandus took this quote quite literally. He ventures deeper into the factory, but there's also a saboteur around. He doesn't see anyone but his children, and he knows someone has been sabotaging the equipment. This is another time where I predicted something fairly early on before the game came out and said it. Mandus, he's probably the saboteur if there's no one else around. Another diary entry also reveals that Mandus is a really sick person, like, really sick. He put orphans to work in his factory and sent them to clean out dangerous pipes because their lives were expendable. If they died, then send another orphan in to clean up that orphan's remains. And if there happened to be some left alive, then those orphans could become pig food. Again, a very big disconnect between this horrible monster and the boring, I want to save my kids guy you're playing as. But then the grand reveal comes in another diary entry. It turns out, Mandus killed his children. I may have guessed that his children were dead, but I'll give the game one thing. I didn't predict that. And here's the most glaring disconnect between the diary entries and the character. After this, Mandus continues saying, "What have you done with my children?" to the guy on the phone and the speakers, despite reading a diary written by himself about how he killed his children. He figures this out soon, but not soon enough to make sense, and his reaction is incredibly underwhelming. He might as well have been saying, "Oh yeah, oops, I forgot I killed my children, haha, silly me." Because spending the whole game obsessed with his children to just immediate acceptance of their death is an incredibly jarring shift. Why did he spend the whole time just worrying about his children and having literally no character development? Well, I'll tell you why, and it's for the other twist near the end. It turns out there is no saboteur. It's Mandus. And it also turns out there's no other voice on the phone. It's Mandus. I guess I'm good at guessing half of these twists. Mandus has amnesia, because I guess this game really does need to rely on the Dark Descent. But it does something different with it. Unlike Daniel and Justine, who willingly put themselves under amnesia, it seems Mandus is just incredibly mentally unstable. From what I gathered, there were two Manduses before the game's events. A good Mandus and a bad Mandus. The good Mandus was the one trying to sabotage the machine under the factory, and the bad Mandus was the one making the machine and the pig beasts. It seems like Mandus has some sort of split personality in this way. Bad Mandus had gotten sick of the world. He saw the orphans, the whores, and the beggars, and saw how people looked at them. Then he saw the upper-class people had the same dirtiness inside, but they were just better at hiding it. So he created a machine. The pigs created would go out into the world, killing everyone, getting rid of the pain of being a man. The beastly way is the only way to live, humanity is disgusting. That's how bad Mandus thinks of things. But present Mandus is much more like good Mandus, albeit with fewer memories. I'm not exactly sure why he has amnesia, but I'll roll with it. The bad Mandus in the present seems to be just a voice in his head taking the form of phone calls and recordings. I think present Mandus was meant to be a blank slate so that this reveal would hit harder, and I suppose it does. I don't think it was worth having a boring main character for the whole game, though. Present Mandus now knows he needs to sabotage the machine, and does so, but not before accidentally letting loose many of the pig beasts on London. Then, to sabotage the machine, Mandus walks up the stairs to sit down in this chair, and I guess that did it. So, my opinions on the story. First, I think that most of this was in his head. I think that the machine and the horrors underneath the factory were real, at least mostly, but I think most of the events of the game were fake. The beasts roaming London end up killing a total of 2 people from what I noticed, and there's far less havoc in the London streets than would be expected. Also, it seems like if this had happened, then Bad Mandus would have already succeeded since he let loose all the pigs already. Another thing that points to it being in Mandus's head is that he imagines his children who don't exist, and he is clearly mentally unstable. Also, this giant room that really should not be under any factory. I don't think it's possible that such a room actually exists. Here's what I think happened. Mandus wakes up with few memories, thinks of how he wants his children, and then remembers the terrible things he's done and sacrifices himself while destroying his factory. The pigs running through the streets are just him remembering what could happen if the factory were to run, and Mandus going up the stairs and sitting down is a vision he has before dying in the factory explosion. Out of the first 3 stories, this one was my favorite. I actually can say I liked it. It may have been very slow-moving and frustratingly told, but at least better told than the previous ones, and it made me think, in a good way this time. I rarely make theories for what I think happened, and this game made me want to. Also, it feels the story's actually trying to say something here. Mandus is a murderer, but did he gain redemption in the end? The half of him that isn't a murderer realized what he had done and managed to stop more chaos, but will there ever even be enough for him to gain redemption? A Machine for Pigs has a clearly very villainous character, but presents him in a way that actually leaves part of him up to interpretation, rather than with Daniel, which had just said, "Alright, he's gone through enough, guess he's good to go now." Bad Mandus was a clearly insane person, seeing the world as rotten and trying to solve it by spreading more pain. But good Mandus didn't know about any of it and did what he could to stop himself. The point of the story is about seeing both the dark and the light in humanity and questioning whether there even can be both or if the evil we have within ourselves is too much to save. Mandus has far more evil in him than the average human, but society as a whole has more evil than Mandus. At that point, if you don't say Mandus can seek redemption, can our society seek redemption? Or is it a person-by-person basis? What makes a given person more evil than the next, and how do we judge those with mental illnesses? There's a lot to discuss regarding the implications of the story, and that is what makes it a great ending. It doesn't take the easy way out this time, and it has something to say, not just being a story for the sake of one. I just wish it didn't take so long to get there. Alright, time to look up the story and see what I got wrong. I guess the story is set on New Year's Eve of 1899, and the voice speaking to Mandus is somehow the soul of Bad Mandus trapped within the machine, so he's not just hearing things. Also, what sparked Bad Mandus to kill his children was seeing them in a vision of World War I, which happens to be a setting we will see later in the series. There's probably more that I got wrong, but it's likely minor stuff or up to interpretation. Hopefully. I always have to hope that I'm not just spouting meaningless garbage about nothing, whether I'm talking about the story, gameplay, or horror. And now to talk about the horror. This has sure been a long talk about the story, and this review as a whole is already longer than my review of the Bad Dream series, which I thought was quite long. Well, it turns out that making the game into a walking simulator actually did not work as intended. I think it could have worked, but not in the way it ended up in the final build. There are no longer tinderboxes in A Machine for Pigs, so to compensate, the game is far more brightly lit, which really doesn't provide a good environment to feel horror. Also, the environments in this game are just far more boring than in The Dark Descent. There's the mansion, the streets, and the factory, and little variety within each location. The factory is the only environment with some creepiness, and it actually does have dark areas. In fact, they look far darker than in The Dark Descent. In that game, at least you can see your immediate surroundings when in the darkness. That was until I realized that the flashlight your character has also has infinite battery. Yeah, I didn't mention it yet, but Magnus has a flashlight here. If the fact that more places are lit up wasn't enough, you now have the ability to light up the place at your own whim, with no drawback. There was a lantern in The Dark Descent, but that had limited fuel and would only light up a small radius around the player, whereas here you can just keep the flashlight on for most of the game and know it'll all be fine. I didn't know that at the start because I assumed it was like the lantern, but I learned and came to use it almost all the time. Sometimes it flickered though, which was like, sure it's spooky, but you're not even going to turn it off? It'd be far scarier if it flickered and then suddenly went off. I could probably count the times I felt scared on one hand. That is, a feeling of dread and uncertainty leading to possible panic. There were many times that the game managed to spook me, but unlike in The Dark Descent, those times lasted a second and made me more annoyed than anything. Just like The Dark Descent, the first hour of A Machine for Pigs is a completely harmless hour. The first time you encounter a monster is in the factory, so the mansion and the street give you nothing to actually worry about. I felt scared when I was in the passageways of the mansion, and hearing things scuttling about. But at some point it just got to be obvious that none of the scares were real. Seeing children running around is an interesting scare, I guess, but you know that's all that's happening. These children are not your enemy, they just exist to scare the player and make Magnus say something about how he wants to save his children. The Dark Descent had you actually hearing the noises of the enemy and having doors open, seeing things run past you, everything that would lead you to believe that there actually is something hiding around you. Here, let's just shake around the mansion. And even when it's an attempted enemy scare, it feels nothing like an actual enemy encounter. Sometimes you can even see the enemy disappear right in front of your face. There were a couple of points where I actually was fooled into believing an enemy was there when it wasn't, but by then it was late enough in the game that I found the enemies to not be as nearly as scary as they were intended to be. The other time I know I got scared was during the first couple of enemy encounters. Here's an incredibly dark area and an enemy which I don't know the abilities of. The lack of knowledge I had of what it did, yet with the knowledge that something can kill me, really does work the first time, so I can't say this was a totally horror-free game. But that ends on encountering the monster for real. The monster or monsters of A Machine for Pigs are these pig beasts with horrible eyesight, horrible hearing, and horrible memory. On the first encounter, I was just trying to sneak around one in the darkness, then I accidentally got up right in front of his face and started walking loudly. It definitely heard that, but it also made me learn that sneaking around makes you basically inaudible unless you happen to be 5 feet away or standing up. In which case you should just be still. I also learned that it seems to have possibly zero eyesight when in complete darkness. So instead of creating a monster that encourages tense encounters, it encourages the player to just stay in the darkness and crouch around while also being able to see the monster the whole time, and since the monster's not going to come attack the player unless the player does something stupid like stand up right in front of it, there is no tension in that situation. I was panicked upon getting up and uncertain about what to do after, but past those first encounters, my uncertainty was gone. I later learned that the monster doesn't even seem to react much if you shine your flashlight on it, as long as you turn it back off quickly again. So now you don't even have to hide in the darkness, you can find your enemy at all times. And I'm going to quote something from the Amnesia wiki, which I found while checking if my intuition was correct, which perfectly describes what I came to learn about their intelligence. Wretches do seem smart enough to manipulate small objects such as building blocks, but also lack object permeance, wherein if they cannot perceive someone such as Oswald himself, he ceases to exist. Thanks to this lack of intelligence, evading the creatures is a trivial task for even a half-competent player, which combined with the lack of sanity mechanic which allows the player to constantly keep track of them, makes sections where they are threats short and simple. They really are the most pointless and uninteresting enemy in a video game, providing little horror past the first encounters. It's not hard to learn about them through gameplay because the encounters aren't nearly as open as in the Dark Descent, so this time you'd be very likely to learn about how ineffective they are. The linearity of this game could have been used to guide the player to encounter the monster but not learn about it, or better yet, just make the monster more frightening. It'd be a lot more scary if, like I first thought, shining the flashlight at all would immediately give away your location. Information would come at a large cost, but you'd have to decide if that cost is better than encountering the monster in the darkness. That's what I thought the game was going to do, with an insanely pure darkness, but instead it just didn't. The other way, you would have to make choices between gaining information and causing the pig to know where you are, or just keeping yourself in the dark and not knowing where the pig is. That would actually be scary, not the game telling you, well, you could turn on your light a little, but don't keep it on too late, please. I died once to a monster, not even the monster I accidentally stood up in front of, but one that came later on. This monster is a pig variant that has a whole electricity look. It appears and disappears out of thin air, and that actually did work for the horror. I'm pretty sure it has the same intelligence as the previous ones, but it also provides a light source itself when it appears, which makes it have an easier time spotting you. Also, the fact that it goes invisible greatly reduces the available knowledge the player has. This monster is the only good monster in a machine for pigs, and it appears for such a short amount of time. There's a section where you have to pull two levers, and after you pull them, the monster disappears. Except the two levers aren't that far away from each other, and the first one won't even lead to you being attacked by the monster. So after dying once, I just decided to run and grab both levers, and that worked perfectly fine. I got hurt, but since there's no health mechanic, a wound was nothing to me. It'd just probably recover my health in a minute anyways. The second time encountering this monster is in a maze, and I did find this pretty scary. I am glad that this game learned something from the Dark Descent and introduced a new mechanic close to the end, instead of leaving one simple mechanic throughout. Although, this is really the only two times where this happens. There is also a section where all the pig beasts are running through the streets, except I'm pretty sure none of them can even attack the player. I gave Amnesia Machine for Pigs a 5 out of 10. A sad attempt at horror that I guess works sometimes, no attempt at any gameplay if the horror fails, and the story sucked until the ending, which I liked. A 5 out of 10 might even be generous for this game, but I can't say I really disliked it. I just kinda went through it thinking, wow, these certainly are places I'm walking through. It's also disappointing because I see so much missed potential with the changes this game made to the formula. Just because it's a walking simulator doesn't mean there has to be no opportunity for puzzles, no matter how simple they are. Gameplay doesn't even have to subtract from the horror, and it can sometimes greatly add to it. It was far scarier in Justine when I had to move a gear over to a contraption while there was a monster after me, making me focus on two things at once while I could die at any moment. Resident Evil 5 and 6 may have taken the series in a direction which is gameplay over horror, but the Resident Evil remakes, 7, and even Village show that a game can both have good gameplay and good horror. It's even clear when playing Village's Dollhouse section to see the possible influences from the Dark Descent. My favorite moments from A Machine for Pigs were when I could take a break from walking around and read one of the notes or journal entries. I think that says less about how good the story was and more about how unsatisfying the game as a whole was. A Machine for Pigs, in every element of its design, seems to be a game intended to be like the Dark Descent, but even geniuser. It takes what the Dark Descent did well and tries to go further with it without understanding of why people liked the game in the first place. In that way, A Machine for Pigs really does feel like a fan-made mod for the Dark Descent. Amnesia Rebirth is yet another game in the Amnesia series, which I felt a bit confused by initially. It was released in 2020, and when it came out, I just assumed it was an attempt to capitalize off of the success of the Amnesia series, since Frictional Games' other projects weren't working well. But as it turns out, Soma was incredibly profitable for them and led to them announcing 3 yet-to-be-named projects. Instead, their stated reasons for making another Amnesia game would be for a shorter development cycle because they know what type of game it is. Makes sense, but it still just kind of feels odd to me that they would choose to release it 10 years after the last one they developed. since A Machine for Pigs was only published by them. And then the bunker releases 3 years later, which is a much shorter gap than even between Soma and Rebirth. I suppose they just wanted to get some game out there, though. One of the praises I hear for Rebirth is in the game's graphics, and I do have to say, it is a quite impressive game for a small studio on the technical side, which may not be reflected well in this video because of some exporting issues. But in my opinion, even with the good technical side of it, it looks stylistically awful for almost the entire game. Half of the game is set in the desert and caves, and the other half is set in a rocky sci-fi place. I don't think I've played a game where I thought the desert looks amazing, but everything here just gives me a plasticky feeling. Like it's all there, but I'd never be able to feel it. In The Dark Descent, although I thought the graphics aged quite poorly and it didn't seem like they had a consistent style, I never got that kind of feeling. The Dark Descent's graphics were just dated and spotty, not off-putting. Looking at Rebirth, I'm realizing that A Machine for Pigs did actually have the best style of the Amnesia games, since in A Machine for Pigs, although the graphics were quite dated, I didn't tend to notice it. Here, everything looks so basic. This desert and caves could be from literally any game, might even fit right into a Call of Duty map. Nothing about this game says Amnesia to me, or even Amnesia Rebirth. And then the half that isn't the desert opts for the most basic sci-fi alien blue glow look. Wow, some gray rocks and other blue glowing things that might fit in with literally any other alien game. Though there were a couple sections that actually did look good and unique. I don't like the saying graphics aren't everything when it comes to criticism of graphics, because although the saying is factually true, it is often used to dismiss any criticism of graphics or style. When you're playing a game, if you're looking at something and just thinking that it all looks fake and bland, that's definitely not a good thing. Of course, it isn't everything about the game can be good without good graphics or even good style, but calling it nothing is missing a part of the game entirely. If a bad game has incredible graphics, then even that might make you think, well, I hate the game, but at least I'm looking at some cool stuff. Style is still more important, though. When I'm playing Vampire Survivors, I don't look at the graphics and think, this game is visually impressive. It has a consistent pixel art style, doesn't randomly try to add some 4K textures in the middle, and goes with it. Rebirth is a game with a bad style and good graphics, and it is noticeable. I remember when I was seeing clips of the game close to its release, and I honestly found myself less interested in the game because it just looked so boring. But yes, the graphics and style aren't everything. So I should talk about the gameplay now. Rather than the walking simulator that A Machine for Pigs was, Rebirth adds the inventory mechanic back, and there's a little twist to it too. You can only hold a total of 10 matches and a limited quantity of lamp oil too. The matches replace the tinderboxes from the first game and work just like matches in real life do. They burn out if you hold them for too long and you have to light a match to light a lamp. I'm not quite sure how this adds anything to the game systems other than making the player think cool, realistic matches, which again makes me think of the game showcasing graphics over anything else, but it doesn't affect a whole lot of how the game works. The 10 match limit, however, does. I was annoyed about it at first, but it makes the matches seem a lot scarcer. I ended The Dark Descent with 20-something tinderboxes left because I kept saving them to stockpile up on light, but here it forces the player to either use the matches more often or be unable to pick up the excess matches. This turned into a good way for the game to encourage the wanted playstyle without forcing the player's hand. The game wants you to use all the matches sparingly, but not so sparingly that you just stockpile up on them. This also ties in with the new fear mechanic. Basically, sanity from The Dark Descent, but slightly different. In The Dark Descent, it seemed that sanity did practically nothing other than blur your vision a little, but here the fear level actually acted as a threat. As your fear went up, these tendrils would start to appear more and more around your vision before sending red flashes and images flashing around your screen. Then, if it went too high, you'd be immobilized and have to struggle in order to get unstuck. This is an actual reason to keep your fear down. It's not just that it affects how scary things look, it could mean life or death if you happen to get stuck during a monster encounter. But aside from these new mechanics, I'd say that Rebirth often feels just as much a walking simulator as A Machine for Pigs did. Sure, you can now pick up more objects in Rebirth, which I loved, and you have control over the lights, but that doesn't really make it a game. Most of the time, you don't need to do any of that. The Dark Descent had you trying to figure out simple puzzles to get from point A to point B, but here, it most of the time is just trying to walk from point A to point B. You have an amulet now in Rebirth, and that adds a whole lot to the gameplay by showing you what direction to walk from point A to point B, or it opens up the blue light doors to get you from point A to point B. There's a very small amount of puzzles compared to The Dark Descent, and more annoying to get from point A to point B than in A Machine for Pigs. Rebirth somehow manages to find a way to make being a walking simulator more unenjoyable than just walking around. Not only do you have to deal with random things such as the amulet, but also some random memories and cutscenes as you travel the winding passageways, which, if you remember, were nothing all that good to look at. Although there are some puzzle segments in Rebirth, like a couple though. If I'm being honest, I love that they were there. The first real puzzle I encountered was this thing where I had to match symbols on stone pillars to the symbols on my screen. Of course, I only had 15 options, so being the guy I am, I decided it would be easier to guess all 15 rather than solve the puzzle. But the next one was a variation on that, which was harder to guess, and that I did enjoy solving far more. Unlike the simple, yeah, I guess I did that, puzzles of the Dark Descent, these puzzles have interesting solutions that feel satisfying to complete and fun to try to think of a solution to. But there aren't many of them. There's that one, some smaller ones involving moving prisms around, and some more smaller ones with moving vitae around, but not many real fun puzzles like that again. The rest weren't bad, just alright. Though I will say that the one fun puzzle I had was enough to make an otherwise stale section into an actual enjoyable time. There were no horror elements in that section of the game with the pillars, yet I completely forgot and just wanted to spend my time figuring out the solution. This is completely different from the previous games where my goal for finishing the puzzle was to get on to the next area, not for the satisfaction of figuring something out. So to summarize the gameplay of Rebirth, without the horror of course, a somehow poorly designed walking simulator, like how do you even do that, mixed in with some simple puzzles and a few good ones. If this game didn't have horror or a story, I would give this game a 1.5 out of 10. Bad visuals, bad walking, and a few good puzzles sparsely placed over the course of 7 hours. Of course, that would be an insanely unfair way to judge a game, because it does have horror and a story. The story begins with the character, Tazi, and her husband Salim, on a plane. You two are going on an expedition in Algeria, much like Daniel from The Dark Descent. The year is 1939, which happens to be exactly 100 years after The Dark Descent, too. Unlike A Machine for Pigs, Rebirth seems like an actual direct sequel. Well, as much of a sequel as one can be set 100 years in the future. The orb that caused all of Daniel's problems is still there, the shadow's ready to kill again, and there are even a few notes left by Daniel's crew. Nothing extraordinary happens by making this a sequel, but it's nice to get a bit more context to the mythology of the Dark Descent. Anyway, the plane suddenly crashes. Tazi wakes up and everyone is strangely gone. But after she makes it out of the plane and into the cave, she learns through notes that the rest of the crew has been in the caves while she was in the plane. So it turns out Tazi has amnesia. She wants to figure out what happened to the crew, and most importantly, find Salim. She traverses through these caves, but weird stuff happens, and now she has an amulet. This amulet can be opened to be used as a compass sometimes, and also to open up any blue glowing passageways which might happen to be around, glowing all blue. So right away, Rebirth is getting all sorts of sci-fi. The Dark Descent waited until the end to introduce its mythology, but here it starts at the beginning. This is probably good if you're a fan of sci-fi stuff, but I'm not. And since I'm sidetracked already, I'll talk about how the story is told in this game. It still has the same diaries that you read, which is a really tired way of telling the story, but now the memories don't just pop up randomly. They pop up only when interacting with certain objects, which honestly serve to make the game far more immersive by not just showing up with random immersion breaks whenever. Although there are random cutscenes whenever, but those are less frequent than the memories. Tazi talks in this game too, making her even more of a present character than Magnus was. This doesn't work all the time, especially a couple of times when she said something about a scare that happened which I wasn't looking at, but it makes her feel like the only character in Amnesia that's really there. There's also a pretty interesting way of telling the memories. You have a list of them in your journal, but they're blanked out until you find them in the game. The drawing style seems to be the only good style the game tries going for, but it's really something off to the side, and it's optional to look at. And the final way the game tells its story is in the loading screens, where you learn about what happened before the expedition. Tazi knows of the story within the loading screens, she only has amnesia of what happened after the crash, so this is just for the player's sake. Honestly, a loading screen is a good place to reveal things like that, because what else are you going to be doing in a loading screen? And the story of the loading screens is probably the saddest in the game. You get to revisit memories of Tazi and Salim's kid, named Alice, likely because of the book Alice in Wonderland. Through these loading screens, you see the kid grow up, start learning to talk, have birthday parties, and do all sorts of kid things. Then comes a doctor's visit. The rest of the game's loading screens show Alice as she progresses from being a normal kid to being hardly able to speak, going blind, and eventually dying, as we also witness the grief of the parents. These loading screens are heart-wrenchingly brutal like that, since even though I suspected Alice had died before the events of the game, I didn't realize it would be like this. I was expecting the game to be dark, being an Amnesia game, but sort of fake dark, like the plasticky graphics. But Rebirth actually shows that it doesn't have a limit to how dark it'll go. And then after Tazi ventures through the caves, she finds Salim dead too. Another thing I was expecting to happen, but not so early in the game. Find Salim, she says, much like Magnus's quest to find his kids. It was early enough in the game that I was expecting Rebirth to hold its punches, making me find more and more of the crew dead until I finally found Salim, who may or may not be alive. But no, he's just dead right away. And Tazi's pregnant. It turns out one of the things Tazi forgot was her pregnancy. Not something you'd typically forget, but Tazi has complete amnesia of recent events. But that's also strange. She's further along in her pregnancy than she thought. How much time has passed since she's been on the plane? That's not important now. What is important is finding the rest of the crew and making it to safety. Tazi leaves the cave, although not without interdimensional travel through an incredibly bland other dimension. Wow, it's dark, foggy, and rocky. And there's a statue. In theory, it looks good, but in practice, I found myself thinking of the numerous other times I've seen things just like this dimension. But she makes it out alive, and possibly even more pregnant. Tazi ends up in this fortress where she hears a radio signal from the crew's doctor and a crew member named Yasmin. This is another section where my expectations were proven wrong. I wasn't expecting there to actually be anyone else alive. This is an Amnesia game. Living people other than the main character only exist for a small part of it, if at all. Rebirth really did manage to take my expectations and deliver me something completely different, which I was glad for, because the past two games had some very boring storytelling, other than the last 30 minutes of A Machine for Pigs. So Tazi's main goal now is to find Yasmin and the doctor, who are in a village a few hours away. But oh wait, she's stuck in another place underground. This underground area appears to be where Daniel's crew originally went 100 years in the past, and Tazi is here for the centennial. It's also an area mixed with very alien elements and strange tomes that Tazi can inexplicably read even though it's from a different language. This is a large part of what led me to believe that Tazi is possessed by an alien. She has weird stuff happening to her whenever she dies, because she doesn't really die when I fail. She just gets weird flashes and moves around and then goes back to where the checkpoint was, feeling all strange. Also, she's getting more pregnant very quickly. This all added on to the fact that she can read an alien language led me to this conclusion. And in this alien place, Tazi takes an orb. Uh-oh. At least she isn't a fool like Daniel, the orb stays intact when she takes it. She still has to deal with the shadow in this game, though, which, in my opinion, is the world's least threatening video game enemy other than the scripted events. It hurts you if you step on it, although not that much. And it can't move, it can just appear places. It's cool that I feel like I'm learning a bit more about the orb and the shadow. It came from an alien race, not just kind of existing as it did in the Dark Descent. And I also get to learn a bit about the alien race from the notes they left. Not that I understood much of it. I did learn one thing which seemed important. There was a queen, made eternal with Vitae, who wanted a child. Her subjects were upset because she was eternal and didn't need a successor, but the queen wanted one just to have a child. This led me to another realization. What if Tazi is possessed by the alien queen? After making somewhat of her way out of the expedition site, she meets another member of her crew, Richard. He's being kept hostage and tortured by an alien. As she goes to try and save him, he tells you to stop. Richard, being the courageous and selfless person he is, realizes that Tazi saving him would make noise and draw the alien towards her, killing her. He convinces Tazi to stay away from him for the moment so they can both get out alive. So Tazi figures out a way to keep the monster away before letting Richard out. What a kind man he is, and I'm glad that he did get out alive. And then Richard decides to punch Tazi and smash her head with a rock, leaving her to die from the monster so that he can get away safely. That dick. Tazi's pretty upset about this too, so she ends up chasing him down and murdering him while stealing his life force. Or maybe that wasn't really Tazi. She'd met another one of her crewmates, Leon, who had been turning into a monster, so maybe that's what's happening to Tazi too. But whether she's a monster or not, she needs to use a portal to get to the village. Tazi's not going to take a few hours' walk if she can portal there now. The portal doesn't take her there directly, and instead leads her through another alien place where she learns about how her new baby has the same illness as Alice, and then Tazi tortures a guy to heal the new baby too. Boy, Tazi has really changed. But she gets another portal, which this time does take her to the village, or pretty close to it anyways. Also, her water just broke. She's been getting pregnant really quickly, so she needs to make it to the village. She goes to the tower to meet the doctor, but uh-oh, bear trap time. Luckily, Yasmin's there to save her, and Yasmin also decides to confess to a few other murders while she's at it. Yasmin has been sick, and the sickness is going to take over her brain. She sets Tazi free, but quickly changes her mind and tries to kill her. Thankfully, the doctor saves Tazi and kills Yasmin. Now Tazzy can give birth to baby Amory, and all is fine. At least until the doctor steals the baby and runs. A ton of stuff is explained right here, and we finally get to the bottom of what happened before Tazzy got amnesia. It turns out Tazzy and the crew met the spirit/ghoul/alien who was actually the Queen. Crew member and general good guy Hank was injured, and the rest of the crew wanted to save him, especially the doctor. The Queen decided to make a deal with them. If Tazzy would give up the baby, then she would heal the crew and get them out of the desert. Tazzy, being fairly attached to her child, does not think this is a good plan and refused, angering the doctor. The Queen decides to be merciful and gives them water of life anyways. It heals Hank and gives each of them the strength to get through the desert. But the Queen's actually not such a nice person, and the water is actually poisoned. The crew members start turning into monsters, some faster than others for whatever reason. Like, why does the doctor appear to not be infected at the end? And it's still taking quite a while for Tazzy to really feel the effects. But the doctor still wants to be saved from this disease, and wants to save everyone else too. So, he steals the baby and tries to negotiate with the Queen. Tazzy finds him and kills him, but the Queen still has the baby. The Queen makes one final offer. If you let me have the baby, then the baby will be safe and not die from the same condition Alice had. There are 3 possible endings to Rebirth. The first 2 are from the simple choice the Queen gives you. Either leave the baby to the Queen, or not. If you don't and escape through the portal, then you end up with the baby in Paris, safe from the Queen, but with the baby's probable future being death from the illness. Also, if you died too much in the game, you end up turning into a ghoul in Paris. The second ending is if you do give the baby to the Queen. Amory lives with the Queen, likely for all eternity, while Tazzy turns into a ghoul and lives in the alien dimension. And the third ending is the one that I happen to be lucky enough to get. Instead of making that choice, you can inject a serum into the Queen's whole blue tube system. This causes the shadow to appear, killing the Queen, Tazzy, Amory, and the whole alien dimension. I think the ending of the game provides a quite interesting choice. Does Tazzy sacrifice her attachment to her kid so that her kid can live a long life? Or is it not the length of the life that matters, but being able to spend it on Earth and with a loving mother? Or is it better to sacrifice everything to save a world left in ruins by a queen willing to torture to get the vitae she needs to survive? There isn't a clear best ending, and each ending sucks in a way. The ending I got most clearly sucked, but it also put an end to any future suffering the Queen might cause, so even that world's destruction is debatable in whether it was bad. Was the story great? No. But was the story good? Also no. I thought the story was just okay. It wasn't frustratingly bad like in The Dark Descent, it wasn't boring until the end like in A Machine for Pigs, but it was just okay. I never got too attached to any of the characters because, like, how many people were on the crew? They got such a small amount of screen time for me to care or remember a single thing about most of the individuals. The plot took some twists I wasn't expecting, like I was convinced Tazzy was possessed by the Queen instead of being a simple ghoul, but twists don't matter much if I just don't care. I don't think an Amnesia game is a good game to tell a story with. It relies too heavily on letters and memories, which are far less engaging than a story happening in the present. The part I liked in A Machine for Pigs was when the main character finally got his memories back and confronted his past in the present. The part that was good in Rebirth was the loading screens, which told a painful story of the death of a child in the present, even though the actual events happened in the past. Diaries and memories are just such an uninteresting and unengaging way to tell a story, and rarely have I seen the game that does it well. Most often it's just an excuse to have some amount of lore for the fans that go crazy for that sort of stuff, and it's not really any actual story. But the Amnesia games are very story-focused, and so should tell their stories with better care. The ending choice was pretty good, but it didn't really give the story much more of a point. It just felt like it took the lore-oriented approach to storytelling in a game where the main focus is on the story, just giving me a feeling like I wasted my time. But of course, what would an Amnesia game be without horror? Just like the past 2 Amnesia games, the first hour-ish has no actual danger to the player. Except, unlike the past 2 Amnesia games, when there isn't any danger, in Rebirth, the game makes no attempt to try scaring you. The Dark Descent's first hour was really scary, A Machine for Pigs had a kinda spooky sometimes first hour, and Rebirth has the most dreadfully boring hour I've played in possibly any video game. At this point, the story hasn't gotten remotely interesting, still being about Tazzy trying to find Salim, and what I said about the walking simulator nature still applies. There is darkness in the first hour. I don't think that qualifies as a horror game, though. This first hour seriously made me think of quitting the game early. Why should I care about the story? Why should I care about the gameplay? What's the point of being a walking simulator when the only thing I have to look at is a bland desert? It's hard to explain just how frustratingly tedious this first hour was, how off-putting the style was, and just how much I don't care I felt. And even worse, the first hour of this game is the longest first hour of the game, since none of them are exactly an hour. I said that if the game had no horror and story, it would be a 1.5 out of 10. I wouldn't say that for any other game, because I had nothing to base that assumption off of. This game, however, I do. I could not imagine playing this first hour for 6 more. I would have a miserable time. Luckily, once you find the fortress with the radio, the game tries to scare you. And it works, like, incredibly well. At one point in the fortress, I found an item that looked like I could pick it up. So I clicked on it, and instead of disappearing and going into my inventory, a monster just suddenly appeared and grabbed it for me. This worked for the same reason the water monster in the Dark Descent worked so well. When you've built up 3 games where what happens when you touch an item is either you pick it up or you move it, you expect that to happen every time. Knowledge just being suddenly replaced with realizing something else that you don't know is happening, and that something else may be something you need to react quickly to, is a terrifying way to scare the player. Not just a cheap jump scare, but a scare that works because of how it defies the player's expectations of safety. There's one more scare like this in the same section, but for the rest of the game, that type of scare is unused. Perfect. It's a scare that's used just enough to make you more cautious about picking up random objects, but not too much that it becomes less scary over time. It definitely could have been used once more near the end to good effect, but it's far better than the overused scares in the Dark Descent or the many cheap tricks of a machine for pigs. But then in the fortress is the first monster encounter. I heard a monster breaking down a door, and my thought was, oh, hey, another meaningless scare. But then it came through. I still wasn't even sure if it was real or just a vision, but I soon came to realize it was real. In the Dark Descent of Justine, my first encounter resulted in me being so panicked that I just hid behind a doorway in the room I happened to be in. Here, I was at such a loss because of the way the game defied my expectations that my only reaction for self-preservation was to hide behind a box and crouch, even with the monster heading right toward that box. There was a doorway right next to me, but I was thrown so completely out of any sane train of thought that I'd rather hide behind a box and fear that the monster might hear me if I went through the doorway, although that wouldn't matter if the monster's coming right at me. That was a great monster encounter. And it shows up again soon after, but this time I thought it would be better to run. Rebirth succeeded yet again at defying my expectations and giving me a pure dose of terror. Leaving the fortress, you end up in the arsenal, which is a quite dark area. But aside from being dark and having bodies in it, there's nothing actually scary about the arsenal. The arsenal made me scared since I had just encountered a monster, but after leaving, I realized something. The game isn't trying to scare me anymore. It was dark, sure, but no scares. Rebirth, as shown by the first hour, has no intent on scaring the player unless there is an actual danger. This may sound like a bad idea in a horror game, but for a part of it, it worked incredibly well. Having horror without danger may have worked very well in the Dark Descent, but Rebirth tries something different, since that got tiresome in the first game anyway. Now, when you encounter a scare, you know that there's danger nearby, or even danger right now. This is a bit of knowledge that certainly reduces your uncertainty, but not in where it counts. Sure, you know that there's danger, but you don't know specifically where, when, or how to avoid it. And that knowledge adds to the other element of horror, the fear. The Dark Descent was a game built on uncertainty, but Rebirth tries to up the fear level, both literally and figuratively. Every scare has that much more weight to it, the knowledge that there really is something lurking ready to kill you. It's a bit of time before the next scary encounter, but I didn't mind it so much this time. I was getting a bit more involved in the story, and the in-between part was where most of the good puzzles were. And the next encounter is not just the scariest in the game, but in my opinion, the scariest in the whole series. The maze. This is the missed opportunity that a Machine for Pigs had, and I'm amazed that I wrote about it before playing this game and realizing that they just put that missed opportunity to reality. You have another flashlight in this game, but just like in the Dark Descent, it has limited oil. Also, the monster will know where you are if you happen to shine it near him. The maze section of the game is terrifying for so many reasons. Basically, you're sent into this maze, and there are many gates around. It's also incredibly dark here, with torches around but spread out pretty far and unlit by default. And to cap it off, there are pressure plates on the ground that open and close some of the gates. But that's not actually the cap, because there's a monster around, and his name is Leon. I initially thought he was just there to make noise and scare the player, but when I turned around and he was there, that just shocked me completely, taking the words right out of my mouth. Get into that area, probably. No! Oh. I thought I was safe because I'd traveled around for a bit without seeing him, but I forgot the game's most important lesson. When there are scares, there's danger. There is just so much about this environment which leads to the absolute terrifying feeling I had. The monster adds to the sheer panic of the situation, whereas the rest adds to the uncertainty. The pressure plates don't have any indicator of what gate they open, the darkness means, well, I can't see much, and the fact that it's a maze means I don't know where the right way to go is. And it gets even worse past that first encounter. Now, more tools are used for panic. You can hear Leon when he steps on the pressure plates making a very loud noise, but also with unclear directionality. Is it the gate opening I'm hearing, or the pressure plate he's stepping on? Panic caused by the knowledge of him being nearby, horror caused by the uncertainty of where he is. And to make it even worse, he can hear you when you step on a pressure plate. A pure tool to cause panic. Want to go through a locked gate? He'll know, and he'll come. He's smarter than the pig beasts, can hear better, and see better. And you can hardly see at all. If you turn on your flashlight, well, like I said, you know he'll find you. If you try looking at him in the dark, don't. Your fear goes up significantly when looking at him, and you don't want to be immobilized where he might be able to see you. There is so much about this place which leads to it being the scariest encounter in all of the games I've played, so much so that as I was re-watching the clips to remember what happened, it made me jump when I saw him. How does that even happen? It's a clip, I'm just looking through what I already know I experienced. Here I'm going to share what is probably the most scared I got in this section, forcing a scream out of me when I'm normally the type of guy who doesn't tend to scream. So I imagine some of these pressure plates have something to do with what I should be doing. I don't know. I don't know, dude. Oh my goodness. First, I was scared by the monster, but then somehow the thing that got the embarrassing scream out of me was the fact that a gate closed because I accidentally stepped on a pressure plate. That was it. And that emphasizes just how greatly scary that environment is. I think I'm safe, yet I know there's still a monster around. There's so much for me to remember in that section that I forget during my panicked run that there are pressure plates which open and close gates. So I'm not looking at the ground, and then I hear a noise and see something move right in front of me, right when I thought I was safe. I don't know what it is, and I am completely left clueless as to how to react. That is horror. This section lasted all of 5 minutes, but it really got to me in those 5 minutes. The next section continued to have monsters to avoid and continued to scare me quite a bit, but nothing can compare to that section. Still, the horror did keep going, which I was glad for. The horror of the next part, where you have to save Richard, is great, but very dissimilar to the maze section. It's a small area with limited options, not a sprawling area with too much to handle. It works, though. I hadn't learned the monster, the maze section didn't give me enough alone time with him. Here, in order to find out how to save Richard, I need to take risks and see how far I can get without the monster taking my life. This really works for uncertainty, because I don't know how far it can go, at least until I receive certain fear from it being in the process of attacking me. I don't know if my hiding spot will be great or even accessible before the monster kills me, though. There's also a mechanic in this game that I didn't mention called hide mode, where holding the crouch button means that you go prone and are less visible to the monster, except you also can't move. This should theoretically work, being terrifying to be powerless against the monster and only hope to live. Unfortunately, it doesn't because it removes all interactivity. All you can do is wait, lessening the immersion and often making me impatient. I didn't use hide mode that often because of that, as it became more of a pain to use. But it's there, I guess. Also, you have a baby, and you can check in on it to reduce fear. That's another mechanic that I found slightly annoying, since you can only check in on it once it kicks, which again reminds me of the memory system in that it gives you a random spot mid-action for you to take a break from the action. It doesn't make you safe, but it does encourage finding a safe spot and taking a break. Both of these mechanics are minor, but worth mentioning. Then, after saving Richard in a short break, comes the next scary part. When I saw this sleeping monster for the first time, I jumped when I saw it, then realized it wasn't doing anything, then jumped again when it jerked around a little. The game managed to scare me twice with one thing, and that one thing wasn't even trying to kill me. More great horror. Although, if you get too close to one of them, it will kill you. This was yet another great section, introducing a new idea that works brilliantly. I didn't know if any of these monsters would stay asleep, how close I could get, or if there was one that was awake already. Turns out there was one, and I died. Uncertainty before seeing it, panic upon seeing it. Good formula, good results. I find it amazing how the Dark Descent takes one single concept and stretches it out to 6 hours, and here Rebirth is like bam, bam, bam with all the new horror concepts. It honestly makes me wonder why the game didn't have nearly as good reception as the first. Was the first hour really that bad? I genuinely thought that the reason why people didn't like Rebirth as much as the Dark Descent was that it took so long to get to the horror. but I think it's because it gets rid of that horror right after introducing it. Most of the remainder of the game is filled with these kind of sci-fi type puzzles and areas from another dimension, and the alien enemy that was present so far is just gone. It appears a couple of times in chase sequences, but that's not the same. In a chase sequence, all you need to do is run. There's no uncertainty, so it's not horror, it's just panic. And there really isn't much panic once you know to just keep running and you'll be safe. There is one other enemy though, and this enemy is a bit scary at first. Then it just becomes annoying. It's this weird floaty thing with a light on it, and if it shines its light on you, then it rapidly increases your fear meter before eventually killing you. I've been referring to what happens to your character as deaths, but technically you never die in Rebirth, the fear parasite just takes over and then resets you. But dying is a more universal term, so it's better to use here. This floaty monster provides you with the joy of the most basic stealth challenge. Avoid the spotlight. There's always one of these sections in a stealth game, and here is no different. But it's not scary. After getting caught once in a beam, all my uncertainty was gone. I knew what happened once you get caught in a beam, I also knew how to avoid it. Just hide behind objects away from the beam and try to move so that it can't catch you. It's such a boring type of monster, and the environments it appears in are never scary because guess what? It's a massive beam of light. You can see everything more clearly and you know where the monster is at all times. And unlike the actual scary monsters, this floaty monster is used a bunch of times. I didn't like that the Dark Descent repeated its scary encounters to the point of annoying me, but why would Rebirth repeat its least scary encounter? Give me another maze! It still wasn't totally without scare, just as the Dark Descent second half wasn't, but it was still less scary than the second half of that game. There were a couple of times when it really got me, such as when I expected to walk up the stairs safely and there was a beam thing there, or the Yasmin jump scare in the desert, but other than that, I can't say anything past the sleeping monsters was anything to remember. I'm going to give Rebirth a 6.5 out of 10. Rarely do I play a game and have mixed opinions on it. Most of the time, if I think of something as a 6 out of 10, it's just a generally okay time. Rebirth, however, is 1.5 hours of absolute tedium, 2 to 3 hours of great exploration, phenomenal horror, and that one puzzle I liked, and 3 hours of meh. This makes it hard to assign a specific review score because of just how varied the game is. It could have been the 1.5, it could have been a 10 out of 10 for being the scariest horror game I've played, and it could have been a straight 5 for all the meh parts that came after and in between. Just because of the part I absolutely loved, I'm going to give the game a score that indicates more positive than negative, but there was a lot of negative. It's honestly a shame that the game didn't live up to its potential as it could have. Better job at realizing it than A Machine for Pigs, but there's so much it could have done better. I initially thought that the reviews were underappreciative of what the game has to offer, but to be honest, after completing a game, I think it has a better rating than it should have. My first impressions from the game in 2020 were boring looking, and while I got more out of it than that, my first impressions were largely right. It really does feel like the game was pushed out because they needed money and were just throwing stuff around to get a complete game. Even though doing my research, I know that not to be true. Although Frictional Games said they had 3 unannounced projects, here we are with The Bunker, 3 years after the last one. When I saw the trailer for this game, I just thought, a new Amnesia game again? Didn't the last one just come out? I made a video where I predicted how good the games would be coming out in 2023, and I would not recommend watching that video because of how poorly made and poorly planned it was, but I was impressed by the trailer nonetheless. The game looked scary, not boring like Rebirth. It's funny how my opinions of those two games before playing were entirely unfounded, just basing it off of the first looks, yet for the most part I agree with my past self. Rebirth had a lot of boring, some brilliant design in between, then boring. And The Bunker? Well, yeah, my opinions were correct. But I'm going to talk about the graphics and style first, since I'm keeping things consistent here. I think that graphically it looks, well, solid. It's not going to win any awards for best graphics, but it looks solid for a decent-sized indie studio in 2023. And really, when it comes to graphics, solid is all that matters. Amazing graphics may allow you a positive distraction from a bad game, but good graphics don't distract either way. This is the only game here that I can judge the graphics on a 2023 scale, and it fits in this year. But what really matters is the style. I hated Rebirth's art style, the Dark Descent kept switching it around, which only highlighted its age, and A Machine for Pigs, well, it actually looked good. The Bunker, well, it knows what it wants for a style and it takes it. It looks like one, feels like one, and even feels like if I could be there, it would smell like one too. The only thing that looks out of place in this game are the rats. Why do they have glowing eyes and look all like that? Is this supposed to be a Plague Tale? I know that they're canonically supposed to be mutant rats, but can't they just be like bigger, grotesque rat things? Still, that is a very small complaint in the grand scheme of things, and it's really the only complaint I have within the style. Although I do have a slight problem with the style itself. And I really mean a slight problem. It's just a boring place to be in. The whole bunker, with the exception of the prison, all looks the same. It's a World War I bunker. That's it. The prison looks like a prison, within a bunker. After you get out of the bunker and the game's practically over, then it does shake things up a bit by looking all like the Rebirth sci-fi world. So I'll give credit where credit's due. It shook things up by bringing back a place I didn't like before. Still, I can't be this unfair by judging the game like that. How else could you set a game in a bunker without making it look like a bunker? It wouldn't make sense to include a whole unrealistic area like the Dark Descent did poorly, and it makes it far better for immersion's sake to have a consistent theme. Not every game has to be a dopamine rush of new things to look at, so for what it's worth, I'm glad the bunker keeps its single setting instead of experimenting. The only times I really thought about it were in the admittedly few moments of downtime, so I can't say that it's going to drag down my opinion of the game even a tidbit by itself. Though if I had to choose which game had my favorite visuals of the series, it would be A Machine for Pigs, since that game managed to look good and consistent, yet it also had at least a little variety. I've been setting up this video so that here would be where I normally talk about the gameplay, but this time the gameplay is so deeply attached to the horror that it wouldn't make sense to separate them. So gameplay and horror goes after the story this time. And well, there is technically a story in Amnesia the Bunker. If the Dark Descent story felt like it was there because that type of game should have a story, the Bunker includes a story because it's an Amnesia game. It just has to have a story about an amnesiac learning about his past through letters. The Bunker tells the story of Henry, a French soldier in 1916. Henry follows his buddy Lambert, and by the way, do not expect me to pronounce a single French name correctly, and Lambert leads Henry to safety. After some blurry memories, Henry finds Lambert in this weird big pit, dying. He tries to save Lambert, but gets blown up by a grenade. Henry then wakes up later in the titular bunker with no memory of what happened in between. There's someone left to help him, or at least it appears. That person soon dies, leaving a gun and a flashlight left for Henry to use against the monster roaming the bunker. So, Henry must roam the bunker, finding letters and a way out. He soon learns that he has amnesia, which he probably already figured out, and that he arrived in the bunker after the grenade incident. He also learns that the way out is blocked by rubble, and he must blow up the rubble with dynamite if he wants to get out. Some superior officers had sealed any remaining soldiers within the bunker so as to stop the monster's escape, the result of many deaths and monster encounters beforehand. It seems as if the Roman tunnels within the bunker had something to do with the monster's appearance, because everything went downhill after the first people explored the tunnels. One soldier in particular recounts the texts he found which depict much of the alien creatures in Rebirth, and the world which they live in. The other soldiers reported seeing similar things in there. And that's most of the story, told within the first couple of hours. The only thing Henry is left to catch up on learning is that it was his fault that Lambert gets sent out to the pit in the first place, but that comes soon afterwards. Now, in the present day of 1916, Henry needs to get out. He opens the emergency gates, gets the arsenal code from the soldiers' quarters, gets the dynamite from the arsenal, the wrench from the maintenance area, and the bolt cutters from the prison. There happens to be one person left alive in the prison, though. Prisoner number 73014, being the only prisoner left here and the only character in the game I've seen alive so far, is of course going to be a great addition to the plot. Except not really, since he dies shortly after and the only thing learned about him is that he is suspected of being a German officer. He also doesn't speak English, or would it be French that he should speak? I'm assuming everyone in the game is speaking French, and the only reason that I hear English is for storytelling's purpose, but if the prisoner speaks German, why can't I understand what he's saying at all? If he chose to speak in French, would I hear French or English? If he chose to speak canonically in English, would I hear French? A lot of unsettling implications caused by the setting. Anyways, Henry goes to the Forbidden Roman tunnels to try to get the detonator for the dynamite. But there's one last person still alive. Toussaint Beaufoy, a soldier who is sealed within the tunnels, and with a name I definitely didn't pronounce correctly. He went crazy, and legends say he still roams the tunnels to this day. If you look at the smoke clearly enough, you may even see him. Toussaint is a shotgun-wielding maniac, shooting at every single noise he hears with a somehow unlimited amount of ammo. You can kill him or leave him at peace to his insanity. Either way, you get the detonator from behind him and blow the tunnel wide open, leading you to finally escape this awful bunker. But oh snap, here's another Dark Descent for you. And a boss fight. You can either just kind of walk past the monster and escape, or kill the monster and escape. If you kill the monster, the ending has Henry escape only for German soldiers to find him. If you don't kill the monster, the ending has Henry and the monster escape, only for the monster to run away and for German soldiers to find Henry. The ending is left ambiguous here. Does Henry die from the German soldiers, or is he taken captive? Either way, nothing good happens to Henry. It really feels like every bit of the story just screamed, we need a story for this game. There's nothing being told here. You have the obligatory person for Henry to lose in the form of Lambert, the obligatory amnesia bit, and the obligatory learning of the story from letters. The amnesia doesn't even make sense here. You learn so little from the letters that it would make more sense if Henry just woke up from a coma. It provides the same experience, but oh no, I guess Henry has to have amnesia since the game series is called Amnesia. Why does Henry not remember waking up for the bunker the first time when he was diagnosed with having amnesia then? Why does Henry not forget anything after the game begins? His condition makes no sense, which really makes it seem like the branding was prioritized over logic. The amount that he learns from the letters, too, is minimal. Just by looking at the place, you can easily see what happened. Of course everyone here died. Is it necessary to find out how they died? I at least felt like the characters here were better than most of the named crew members from Rebirth. In that game, whenever one of them was mentioned, I just thought, was I supposed to remember that person? Here, although I completely forgot multiple people's names and what they did, I felt like there would be at least some reason for me to care about each person. It's not a total loss that they just retold what the player pretty much already knows, it just feels like they really needed this to be an amnesia game. The only real new information that Henry and the player learn about after waking up is the Roman tunnels, which is just the same mythology from Rebirth and the Dark Descent. And the ending choice. It doesn't mean anything. Do you do something good for humanity and kill the monster, or do you just not have a care in the world and feel like letting the monster roam free throughout Europe? It's a monster that can't be killed with bullets, but sure, let the general population deal with it? There's no choice to be made here. Either you kill the monster, or you likely just walked past there without even realizing you could kill the monster. Or maybe you just aren't taking the game seriously. There was a clear conundrum to the choices in Rebirth and even the Dark Descent, but here, we need to find a ending choice or it won't be an amnesia game. That's what the whole story feels like. I was interested to learn about what happened in the bunker, but it just turned into nothingness. The story to the bunker is a pointless waste of time, even leaving it ambiguous because writing a definitive ending wouldn't feel amnesia enough. It sure is a good thing that the bunker isn't just a story. Amnesia the Bunker does the opposite of what the previous games were known for. Instead of taking the power away from the player, the bunker makes the controversial choice to make the gameplay a World War I trench shooter similar to Battlefield 1, using only your wits, a revolver, and a shotgun to mow down the German troops. Well, that's how it seems some people were reacting to the game when the trailer released. The player is a gun, you know, the thing Amnesia was so unique for not introducing. But it really doesn't work that way. The FPS thing is only used in the intro, the rest of the game is something completely different. Though I was pretty shocked when the game actually asked me to use a gun to mow down German troops in the intro. It didn't make Amnesia into a first-person shooter, but it does turn it into a complete survival horror game. The Dark Descent had no real survival tools, so while it could technically be categorized as a survival horror type game, it wasn't. The bunker is. You may not be able to kill many enemies, but that isn't specifically what survival horror is about. And there are actually enemies you can kill. These rats, which you can kill by blowing them up, shooting them, or burning them. The rats aren't really a source of horror, since they have these big glowing eyes you can see from a mile away and aren't much of a threat other than attracting the monster. But they're an obstacle nonetheless. And for the rest of the survival horror, you have tools that you can use to your advantage, and that's the important part. Bandages, medkits, and cloth to make bandages form your basic health items. Bottles act as an item to throw if you want to distract the enemy. Or you could turn it into a Molotov, setting anything you want to on fire. Then you have your standard ammo boxes and grenades. The bunker is a solid survival game, as you have to deal with the inventory and managing what items to take with you on your next expedition out of the safe room. I didn't use the bottles until near the very end, since most of the time when I needed a distraction, the monster had already seen me, so I ended up stockpiling bottles in the safe zone. The same thing happened with the healing items, since I, well, tried not to get hurt too much. But those items still felt like they had specific uses, they weren't just puzzle items. The main gameplay loop of the bunker revolves around the map of the bunker. You end up in the safe, secure administration room, and you need to get the items for getting out of the bunker. So it's off to these other wings to grab the necessary items and back to safety and then back to the next wing. Well, I can't really talk much more about the gameplay without getting to the horror. In my opinion, the bunker really is the scariest Amnesia game. Not the game with the scariest moments, but the most consistently very scary game out of any of them. I took a small break for a couple of days after finishing part 2 of my gameplay series, and I was dreading coming back to the game. That's normally a sign that the game is bad, but not here. Here I was dreading having to face the monster again. What I first thought after playing the demo in the first hour of this game is that the monster didn't come out much, but when it comes out, I would have to hide somewhere or run back to the safe administration room. I could hear the monster getting ready to come out, since the monster was quite loud. I could see these little holes for the monster to come out of, and made sure to take note of how I could best run from them. The atmosphere of this first hour is terrifying. I never knew when the monster was going to come out, because this isn't a scripted game anymore. The bunker is a randomized, open-worldish game, since you have free roam of most of the bunker, and the monster is for the most part, unscripted. So I happened to not be seeing the monster much at all, but at any time, it could come out. And I wouldn't know what to do about it. I could keep watching the holes, but if it comes out behind me, I'd probably die. Is it faster than me? Then I can't run. Every time I heard a sound, I thought it might have been close to the end of my life. To add on to all this, the only light source I had was this very noisy flashlight. Not only would the light attract the monster, but the noise would too. Amnesia the Bunker manages to make its horror so effective through weaponized knowledge. It's a technique that has been used before in the series, such as in Leon's maze section in Rebirth, but here it becomes the whole game design. Every single thing I learned about the game managed to terrify me more. I said that my idea for horror is being built off of panic and uncertainty, and this weaponized knowledge manages to increase both. The flashlight is perhaps the best use of this. You know that it makes noise, but that immediately raises more questions which increase your uncertainty. Can the monster hear me from here? What will it do if it hears me? Should I bother using the flashlight, or is it less dangerous in the dark? Of course, the darkness is insanely dangerous considering you can barely see 2 feet in front of you, but it brought that question in dim light spaces. The World War I bunker style that I mentioned was not my type of thing was entirely a personal preference if I had to be looking at something for a while, not a matter of horror. An actual World War I bunker is a very scary place to be in. There's no way out and little light, which makes the style so effective for supporting the horror. The noisy flashlight makes sense for World War I and nowhere else. And oh yes, the flashlight also brings so much reason to panic. Just winding the flashlight without hearing anything is reason enough to panic. You may just be thinking after winding it once, it heard me, I need to get out. The monster can hear, and the flashlight is here to show up with an immediate possibility of danger every single time you wind it. Or even when you sprint, since that makes a lot of noise too. Hearing a noise does not just give you something to be scared of coming from there, but also something coming to here. And the most terrifying part of weaponized knowledge the game brings is the knowledge that the game is randomized. If you went into the game without knowing that, then I bet the game would be a whole lot less scary. Me though, I played the demo. I was excited for the game before it came out, and you bet I read the Steam description before playing. I didn't get any spoilers, but the information Frictional Games was willing to release to the public was enough to set my expectations very poorly for what was actually coming. I just mentioned everything that scared me when starting the game, but what scared me most came 50 minutes in when I got an achievement. Survived first encounter with the beast. A nasty trick. I mentioned that the previous 3 games had a first hour with no monsters, and while they didn't last exactly an hour, they all had the same design philosophy that it wasn't good to show the biggest horrors straight away. But I came into the bunker with the knowledge that the game was randomized. The monster could attack me at any time, it just happened to not show itself very often. I was playing on normal mode after all, not hard mode, so I suppose it would make sense that I didn't see it once. After all, I'm a competent player, and I guess I must be doing something good to avoid it. Nope. Weaponized knowledge added again. First, the knowledge that the game was randomized. This made me both not know when the monster was coming out, and also know that it was impossible to guess when the monster would come out. Uncertainty? Check. The next thing it did was let me know at any time I would not be safe. Panic? Check. If I didn't come into this game with this knowledge, then it would just be a machine for pigs or a Rebirth again. I expect it to repeat the same design tricks, so when I see spooky things, I don't immediately think there's a monster around. But this game tried to be different. It was different by being the same. But the second bit of weaponized knowledge here is that achievement. I was terrified in that first hour, jumping at every little noise I heard or made. So here, the game is telling me that what I just encountered was the tutorial. I hope you had a fun time walking around, now you can be scared for real. Once you've unlocked all the wings of the bunker, the game transitions to the real thing. The monster comes out quite frequently, far more than I was expecting from my tutorial. I was even thinking after this point that I would become less scared of the monster because of how frequently it appeared, similarly to the monster in the Dark Descent. That monster was overused, and it wasn't even there for the whole game. Here, there's a single monster always there. A shorter game taking me about 5 hours and 10 minutes to complete, although for whatever reason the game timer doesn't include the time I lost for dying. But being shorter by an hour shouldn't make much of a difference. I got used to the Dark Descent monster after 3 hours. This one shouldn't last 5. But it does, at least for the most part. That is because learning about the Dark Descent's monster made me know more about it, but learning about the monster in the bunker made me know less. Weaponized knowledge, yet again. The game actively works to prevent any real knowledge from being gained about the monster while giving the illusion of doing so. The first thing to know about the monster is that it is very loud, which should immediately give it away. And it does, technically. Now you know that there's a monster somewhere nearby. Great! It could be in the walls, it could be right behind you, it could be coming out of one of the holes. There's no real way of telling, even if you know its direction, so all that the monster's sound adds is extra horror. Panic from knowing there's a monster, uncertainty of what the noise means. I think my favorite bit of weaponized knowledge is from when the monster comes out of a hole. Before doing so, smoke appears, since the monster's big and all, rattling the whole place. So if I see smoke near a hole, run. But that's not always a good idea, since I came to learn later that smoke could come from the bunker just settling or the monster moving around but not coming out. A visual cue which not only serves to obstruct vision, but also give a reason for potential danger and no easy way of telling if it's real danger or even where the danger may be. There was only one bit of information that slightly made it less scary. The monster is slower than the player when the player is sprinting. Though you have to accelerate before going to full sprinting speed, so the monster could catch up. This bit of information only helped when I knew where to hide and where the monster was coming from. Otherwise, it's useless. If I happen to be near a dead end and it comes from the other side, well, I'm screwed. If it comes out and sees me as I run under a table or in the dark, then I'm screwed. If I'm literally anywhere I haven't been before, then you guessed it, I'm screwed. And the main gameplay loop really works into this. Find a new location, look around it, and go somewhere else. Being unfamiliar with an area just added so much to the horror of it. Nowhere immediate to hide, no knowledge of where the monster will be, and depending on where you are, you might not remember how to run back. I think just the fact that the style of the game is a World War I bunker throughout the whole thing really does add just that much to the horror, because it's harder to tell the difference between areas. I complained about how it looked boring, but a boring setting is the absolute perfect place for this game. You may think one place looks familiar and go there before realizing it's not, and there's actually nowhere to hide where you are. At one point, I meant to run back to the administration room, but instead made a wrong turn and ran into an area I'd never been before, the arsenal and tunnels. I got even more terrified running into a new place, and somehow made it back alive, but not without my brain going into complete panic mode the whole time. This is what a real chase scene is like. Not those scripted chase sequences in Rebirth, but an actual chase which wasn't necessarily supposed to happen and could realistically lead to death. There's a slight problem when traveling to new areas that the game does all its loading then, which drastically decreases your FPS. But it's far better than a loading screen taking you out of the game completely. And wow, the save system and death system really works to add real stakes to each death. One criticism I saw of Rebirth was that the character doesn't really die, just gets sent back a little. That's kinda how all games work with death, but for Rebirth it was canonically, so I could see how that may impact the stakes. But here, the stakes are what you make it. You can only save in the administration room an infinite number of times, but only there. This means that when you go out and die, you lose every bit of progress since the last time you saved. The light in administration turns off if it's been, if I had to guess, more than 5 minutes since you've last saved, which prevents needless loss from just forgetfulness, but does not prevent anything if you've been out for a while. When I was running back and accidentally went through the tunnels, I also got some good stuff. And I didn't want to lose that stuff. So a terrifying chase, but a terrifying chase with a greater reason to care about dying. This really adds to the panic factor of it, since there's a whole reason to panic. To make it even worse, you're likely going to have to risk a lot no matter what at some point in the game. After playing the demo, I also mistakenly thought that you could just play the game safer with more trips to the administration room and lower stakes. Of course, in the demo that worked fine since the monster doesn't appear like normal, but in the main game, it's a really bad idea. That is because of the fuel and inventory system. The game emphasizes that you can play it how you like, but in reality, you're going to play it a specific way. The safe room has a generator, and this generator runs on the fuel which you find throughout the bunker. If the generator goes out, then the lights go out. This was fine in the demo, I just used my flashlight a lot for light instead. Scary because of sound, but not much else. But when there's a real monster around, it's so much worse. The monster doesn't like the light, and will therefore come out less frequently in the light. So if you play the game taking low risks, running back to administration more often, then you'll be getting less fuel in your expeditions, and it'll result in the lights turning off. This is not an ideal situation. Ultimately, it ends up being that taking the higher risk by staying out often comes at less of a time cost than playing the game slowly but safely. If you play it safe, then it's going to take longer to get the items you need because the monster will kill you more often in the dark, even more added onto the fact that you need to rely on a super noisy flashlight. I spent most of my time with enough fuel, but when the lights first turned off, that was terrifying. I had just gotten the dynamite and needed to safely get back to administration without dying. This wasn't even me playing the game super slowly, although of course if I'd been playing it more quickly the fuel wouldn't have run out, but I was instead out there with a bunch of progress made. It would have been the best idea to walk back there slowly with my flashlight and maybe resorting to shooting the monster if I absolutely had to. Instead, I panicked. I ran back hoping to not encounter it and ended up running straight into it. With no time to pull out my gun, I immediately died, losing valuable progress. There isn't really any frustrating progress loss if you play the game right, as my longest time between saves was only 10 minutes, and if I died I could probably do it faster the next time. But all that matters is that the player feels the stakes. The very limited inventory even encourages a specific playstyle by balancing between staying out long due to oil and having to go back due to not being able to carry everything. The second time I ran out of power was at the end of part 2 of my Let's Play, and that was when I was too afraid to come back. After all, who would after the last time? And this time I had just escaped maintenance, possibly needed to go to the prison, and was out of bullets. Well, thanks for bringing it up. On the subject of bullets, did the guns and grenades make the game less scary? To a degree, yes. But it also provided its own kind of weaponized knowledge. You have a gun which can temporarily stun the monster, sure, but it's temporary. And how many bullets do you have? Too few to stock up on them. You need to shoot certain padlocks too, so you can't use them all on the monster. Of course, you could also blow up the padlocks or possibly do something else since the game emphasizes creativity, but it really amounts to the same thing. An incredibly limited amount of self-defense resources. I used 2 bullets in maintenance after trying so hard to avoid using a single one, so past then I had no self-defense at all. If the monster saw me, well, I'm screwed. This weaponized knowledge works in 2 ways. First, if you have bullets. It lessens the panic slightly, but increases the uncertainty greatly. Is this the right time to use a bullet? Can I even use a bullet here? A typical Resident Evil game will limit your bullets, but it's often an easy choice to just shoot the monster if you really feel like it. Here, it's better to do everything in your power to avoid shooting the monster. And the grenades probably wouldn't even do much of anything against the monster considering that they take time to detonate and the monster is pretty quick on its feet. The monster may blow itself up accidentally, but it's hard to time it on purpose. Also, it's great that those hopeless moments have tension now. In the Dark Descent, if the monster saw me and it was faster, I'd basically have the only option of throwing my hands up and saying, "Oh well." In Rebirth, the hide mode which forced you stationary was pointless because you could do literally nothing and it made it so much less immersive. Here, a little bit of tension is preserved by giving you something to do when in an otherwise unwinnable situation. There are likely going to be times when you can't pull out the gun in time, but if you're cornered, then you wait there with a gun out, not just sitting in a corner. There is so much uncertainty in every single element of the bunker, that compared to the atmosphere built up in the start of the Dark Descent, this feels like the next evolution. Complete uncertainty everywhere versus scripted uncertainty sometimes. Of course, remember that I'm not saying the more confusing a game is, the better. Since there is a panic element to horror, if a game is confusing and I don't know what's happening or at all why I'm dying, then there's no reason to panic, because I guess death is just going to happen whenever. But there is always a reason to panic too in the bunker. That's what this game gets. I'm not going to say that the whole game was that scary, or that the gameplay was incredible. There weren't really any puzzles here, just ways in which you can deal with the monster. I also had one point where I had to look something up because I assumed the next thing I needed to get was in the tunnels, but then found out I'd have to explore the other areas to get the bolt cutters first. Left on my own, I would have probably never even walked over to those other areas if I hadn't found that out, and I honestly think that's because this game was released in 2023. There's a big red circle on the tunnels. That means that's where I need to go. In most modern games, if it tells you to go somewhere, there tends to be little reason to do anything else. It isn't a criticism of the bunker and is obviously entirely my fault, just more me commenting about how games can't really go back to the way they were. The expectations go deeper than just monetary incentives for fitting the mold, but so much more that I just expect every game to share the same design philosophy. You could make more games like The Dark Descent, but The Dark Descent's already been made, and like I said, playing it now is less effective because of what other games have taken from it. I often see people talking about how modern games are getting worse, but I don't really think that. I just think they're getting different. It's easy to say that games should be made like old ones, but, well, those games already exist. Should that game just be made again? I suppose that's what remakes are for, since I don't think many people would actually play a game like the fixed camera Resident Evils in 2023. There's a vocal amount of fans that I certainly believe would actually play it, but not enough to warrant companies actually investing money in a completely new game with the same gameplay type. Ultimately, game design is going to move somewhere else from the modern oversaturated trends, and people may talk about how there aren't many games like there were in the 2020s. It's disappointing to know that I may never get a true game like Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six or Rainbow Six 3, since I loved those games and found both to be very unique single-player experiences which I haven't seen recreated since, but the world has moved on. At some point, I will have to admit that the joy I felt playing them will never be recreated again, only living in my memories. And just like that, the bunker moves on from its monster once you try escaping the tunnels. In order to get the detonator, you need to get past Crazy Man to Saint. This section is hardly scary since you have more knowledge than he does. You can see him better, you can throw bottles to distract him, and he's singing the whole time, making it easy to hear him. You can even just toss a grenade at him, blow him up, and steal his shotgun. It's like the maze section from Rebirth with limited vision, but without any of the reason to be scared. I'm pretty sure Toussaint is blind too. Then, going down and out of the tunnels, you meet this bridge area where you do a very Amnesia thing and have a final boss fight explosive showdown. Get your shotgun and revolver out here and just straight up kill the monster. A fun boss fight, granted, but scary? Hardly. I was surprised a few times, but it wasn't horror. And it was pretty disappointing that he just died from running into an explosive barrel and falling to his death, without me getting to use my shotgun at all. I give Amnesia the Bunker a 9 out of 10. It was almost a 9.5, but I just got a feeling of nothingness towards the end. The story went nowhere, the horror went nowhere, and the gameplay concluded in a confusingly designed boss fight. I know I missed some pages and a couple of locked rooms, but what's the point of unlocking them or even getting the shotgun if the only thing you can use it on is the final boss fight, which doesn't even need a gun to complete? Once you get close enough to the end, exploration feels pointless. The only real important bit I found out about after writing this review was that Lambert's actually the monster, but that doesn't change what I said about my opinions of the story. Still, The Bunker is an intensely scary and fun game, and stays that way despite only using one trick throughout the whole game. I could imagine that if I played this game in 10 years' time, I would feel the same as I do about The Dark Descent now, since it really did just take one unique gimmick and stretch it out for a whole game. But for the here and now, this game was an incredible, fun, and terrifying experience. In fact, the only Amnesia game I'd describe as fun. Here are my top 3 reasons why this review video is entirely useless. Number 3. I am rating these games based on playing them in 2023, not the year they were released, making it an unfair competition. Number 2. I am assigning review scores to the games as a whole, not specifically the horror of the game. Which makes it weird to compare how good a horror game is to if I were to say Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 is a 7 out of 10. Does that make it an equal experience to The Dark Descent? Number 1. I spoiled literally everything about the games in this video. Not just the story, but the horror too. If there's any reason for a review, then it would be so that someone might see if they want to play a game after watching the review. Of course I know the reason why I made this video. I'm not saying this video feels pointless or fishing for compliments, I know why this video exists. For fun. I had fun playing these games, making videos on them, and writing these reviews. And I hope you had fun watching this. I just find it kind of funny that I'm calling this a review video when it defeats the purpose of a review. And I'd like to comment on the direction the Amnesia series is headed in. I know I said that the gun in the game doesn't make it a first-person shooter, but honestly it feels like it actually is heading in that direction. Being a more Resident Evil type survival horror game, and especially with a boss fight and the shotgun at the end, it really felt different from the rest of the Amnesia games. The monster, if anything, reminded me of Mr. X from Resident Evil 2. In my opinion, the Amnesia series should have ended after the first one. The first game had something it wanted to do with itself that was entirely unique at the time, and succeeded on its own merits. A Machine for Pigs was a narrative-driven walking simulator that took the Amnesia name, and was more harshly criticized as a result. Rebirth, I feel, was a pointless game to be released, and it probably wouldn't have been if not to push out an Amnesia sequel, even with the great moments it had. And The Bunker? Well, I stand by what I said. It feels like the people working on the game wanted to make a game called The Bunker, but then had to force in an Amnesia plotline. It's an amazingly terrifying survival horror game set in a bunker, not an Amnesia game. I think it's okay to leave things in the past. In a way, it makes it more special. Call of Duty hasn't changed a thing about its base gameplay formula through all 20-something of its releases, and can you name a single happy Call of Duty fan? If there is want or need for a sequel, or some creative wishes, then by all means release that sequel, but not just for the sake of one. A Machine for Pigs could have been a fun little mod, The Bunker could have been a new great survival horror IP from Frictional, and Rebirth could have gone to hell. It's great to see new releases that bring back a familiar name or concept from the past, but in most cases, the past experience is one that you're never going to have again. You can't watch a TV show twice and expect the same twists to shock you. The same is true with games. It doesn't make new releases worse for that, it just makes them new. Amnesia the Bunker has been one of the best games I've played this year, possibly the scariest horror game I've ever played, and it is a new, modern type of game. Though I know how much it would be nice to have a new game like one of your older favorites. If Ubisoft announces a Rainbow Six 3 remake, then I will gobble it up instantly like it's Thanksgiving and I'm a cannibal turkey, but otherwise it'll always be this itch I just can't quite scratch. Gaming has changed. It hasn't changed for the better or for the worse, but it's changed. And remember, you've changed too from experiencing these games.